Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the most terrifying chapters in human history. Picture this. The year is 1157 before the Common Era. In the Grand Palace of ancient Egypt, a young pharaoh lies dying. His name is Ramses V and he is barely in his 30 seconds. But here is what makes his death so haunting. His entire body from his face down to his chest is covered in raised postular bumps. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. His skin looks like it has been invaded by something that nobody in his court can understand, something that nobody can stop. The royal physicians try everything, herbs, prayers, rituals, but nothing works. Within days, the mighty pharaoh is dead, and for over 3,000 years his mummified body would carry the scars of this mysterious killer, preserved in time like a warning from the ancient world. What killed him? Was it truly the disease that would go on to reshape civilizations, topple empires, and kill more people than all the wars in human history combined? Tonight, we are going to find out. So, before we dive deeper into this ancient mystery together, I would really appreciate it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I am sharing with you tonight. Maybe drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from or what time it is in your part of the world right now. I absolutely love hearing from you. And hey, make sure you are comfortable. Dim those lights maybe. Turn on a fan for some gentle white noise. Get yourself cozy under the blankets and let's embark on this journey through time together. Now, let me take you back to that moment in ancient Egypt. Imagine standing in the burial chamber where Ramses V was laid to rest. The air is thick with incense and mystery. His body has been carefully preserved through mummification, wrapped in linen, prepared for eternity. But when modern archaeologists finally unwrapped his mummy in the early 1900s, they found something absolutely chilling. His skin, even after more than 3,000 years, still bore the unmistakable marks of those raised pustules. Scientists studied his remains closely. They measured the distribution of the lesions. They analyzed the pattern. And their conclusions sent shivers down the spines of historians and medical experts alike. Ramses V may very well be the earliest known victim of smallpox. But here is where it gets really interesting. For the longest time, scientists were not completely sure. See, proving that smallpox existed in ancient times has been one of the biggest mysteries in medical history. We had the mummies. Ramses V was not the only one. There were at least two other Egyptian mummies from around the same time period from the 18th and 20th dynasties whose skin showed similar lesions. But having visible scars is one thing. Having definitive proof is another. Researchers tried everything. They wanted to take samples from Ramses V's pules to examine them under electron microscopes to search for viral particles. But the Egyptian authorities said no. These were sacred relics after all. So, for decades the debate raged on. Was it really smallpox? Or could it have been some other disease, chickenpox maybe, or some other pox-like illness that has since disappeared? Then, in 2023, something incredible happened. A team of scientists in Italy decided to approach the question from a completely different angle. Instead of looking at mummies, they looked at genes. They studied the genetic code of the variola virus. That is the scientific name for the Smallpox virus, and compared modern strains with historical strains. They even examined viral DNA extracted from Viking Age, skeletons dating back to the 7th century, and by using some seriously complex mathematical models, something called the time-dependent rate phenomenon, which basically accounts for how fast viruses evolve over time, they were able to trace the family tree of the Smallpox virus all the way back through history. And guess what they found? The variola virus, the one that causes smallpox, is more than 3,800 years old, maybe even older, which means that yes, it is entirely possible, even probable, that Ramses V died of smallpox. Let that sink in for a moment. 3,800 years. That means this virus has been with us since the time of the ancient Egyptians, the time of the pharaohs, the time when the pyramids were already ancient monuments themselves. It is almost incomprehensible, is it not? But where did it come from? That is the question that has fascinated scientists for generations. The honest answer is we do not know for certain, but we have some pretty compelling theories. Most experts believe that smallpox likely originated somewhere in the east, either in the Indus Valley, which is modern-day India and Pakistan, or possibly in Egypt and the Near East, or even in ancient China. These were the regions that had something crucial for a virus like smallpox to thrive, massive populations living close together. You see, smallpox is what scientists call an obligate human pathogen. That is a fancy way of saying it can only survive by jumping from human to human. It does not live in animals. It does not hide in the soil. It needs us. And more specifically, it needs a lot of us living in close quarters, interacting constantly. Researchers estimate that for smallpox to establish itself as an endemic disease, meaning a disease that is always present in a population, you need a community of at least 200,000 people. Think about that. 200,000 people living together, trading, traveling, interacting. Before cities and civilizations, before agriculture brought people together into dense settlements, smallpox could not exist. It would burn through a small tribe, kill or immunize everyone, and then have nowhere to go. It would die out. But once humans started building cities, once we started living in populations of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, suddenly smallpox had the perfect breeding ground. Ancient Egypt around 1500 before the Common Era, check. The Indus Valley civilization around 2000 before the Common Era, check. Ancient China during the Shang dynasty, check. These were some of the first places on Earth where human populations were dense enough, large enough, interconnected enough for a virus like smallpox to take hold and never let go. And here is where the story gets even more fascinating. We have these ancient medical texts from India called the Charaka Samhita and the Sushruta Samhita. These are incredibly detailed compilations of medical knowledge written sometime between the 1st and 4th centuries of the Common Era. And in these texts, there are descriptions of a disease that sounds an awful lot like smallpox. The symptoms match, the progression matches, the devastation matches. Ancient Indian physicians wrote about fever, about rashes that started in the mouth and throat before spreading across the entire body, about pustules that left permanent scars on survivors. It is hauntingly accurate. But here is the puzzling part, and I find this absolutely intriguing. If smallpox was indeed ravaging ancient civilizations for thousands of years, why do we not see more written descriptions of it? Think about it. We have the Bible written and compiled over many centuries. We have the Talmud full of detailed discussions about diseases and ritual purity. We have the writings of Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, who lived in ancient Greece, around 400 before the Common Era. And yet none of these sources, none of them, contain clear, unmistakable descriptions of smallpox. Why? Some historians think it is because smallpox was simply accepted as a normal part of life, like the common cold is for us today. Maybe it was so ubiquitous, so ever-present, that ancient writers did not think it was worth special mention. Or maybe, and this is where it gets really interesting, maybe the virus itself was different back then. Maybe the ancient strains of smallpox were less deadly, less distinctive, less memorable than the strains that would emerge later. We know from genetic studies that viruses evolve, they mutate, they change. It is entirely possible that the smallpox virus of 3,000 years ago was not quite the same monster that would terrorize the world in later centuries. There is another theory that I find particularly compelling. Some scientists believe that smallpox might have made the jump from animals to humans relatively recently in human history. Maybe around the time that people started domesticating camels. You see, genetic studies show that the varroa virus is closely related to two other pox viruses, camelpox and a virus found in a rodent called the Tatara gerbil. Both of these animals live in arid climates. Think deserts. Think dry grasslands. And both of these animals came into close contact with humans when we started using camels as pack animals. Archaeological evidence suggests that camels were first domesticated in southern Arabia or the Horn of Africa sometime around the 12th century before the Common Era. That is right around the time of Ramses' fifth coincidence. Maybe. Or maybe that is when the virus made the leap from animal to human, finding its perfect new host. Now, I want you to imagine what it must have been like for the first people to encounter this disease. Put yourself in their sandals for a moment. You're living in ancient Egypt or ancient India or ancient China. Medicine as we know it does not exist. Antibiotics are thousands of years in the future. You do not know about viruses or bacteria or immune systems. All you know is that sometimes, seemingly at random, people start getting sick. It begins with a fever. Nothing too unusual there. But then, after a few days, something terrifying happens. The sick person's mouth and throat break out in sores. Then the face, then the chest, the arms, the legs. Within a week, their entire body is covered in hundreds, sometimes thousands of raised fluid-filled pustules. The pain is excruciating. The fever is relentless, and about 30% of the time the person dies. Just dies. Sometimes within days, sometimes within weeks, but the outcome is the same. And if they survive, they are left blind or scarred or both. Their face, once smooth, is now covered in deep, pitted scars that will never fade. Some lose their eyesight completely because the virus damaged their corneas. Others are left sterile, unable to have children. Can you imagine the terror? Can you imagine not knowing why this was happening? Not knowing how it spread, not knowing who would be next. The ancient Egyptians might have thought it was a curse from the gods. The ancient Indians might have seen it as punishment for sin. The ancient Chinese might have believed it was an imbalance of vital energies. But whatever they believed, one thing was certain. Smallpox was absolutely terrifying. And yet, here is something that gives me chills every time I think about it. Even in those ancient times, people made one crucial observation that would eventually save millions of lives. They noticed that if you survived smallpox, you never got it again, ever. It did not matter if you nursed the sick. It did not matter if you lived in a house full of infected people. Once you had survived smallpox, you were immune for life. Ancient peoples did not understand why. They didn't have the concept of immune systems or antibodies, but they knew it was true. They knew it in their bones. And this observation, this simple empirical fact, would become the foundation of one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That is a story for later. For now, I want you to sit with his image. The mummy of Ramses V lying in a museum in Cairo, his skin still bearing the marks of a disease that may have been one of the very first encounters between humanity and Smallpox, a disease that would go on to kill more people than the plague, more people than both world wars combined, more people than any other single infectious disease in recorded history. 300 million people died of smallpox in the 20th century alone. 300 million, that is roughly the entire population of the United States today, gone just from one disease. But smallpox did not just kill people, it changed history, it toppled empires. It decided wars. It shaped the world we live in today in ways that most people never realize. And the truly remarkable thing, the thing that still fills me with awe and hope, is that humanity eventually figured out how to fight back, not just to treat smallpox, but to completely eradicate it from the face of the earth. We did that. We actually did that. Smallpox is the only human disease in history that we have driven to extinction, and the story of how we did it is nothing short of miraculous. But before we get to the triumph, we need to understand the tragedy. We need to understand just how much devastation this tiny virus caused as it spread from those ancient civilizations in Egypt, India, and China outward across the entire world. We need to understand how trade routes became highways of death, how empires rose and fell because of this disease, and how for thousands of years smallpox was simply an accepted part of human existence, as inevitable as birth, as inescapable as death. So here is what we know for certain as we close this first chapter of our story. Smallpox is ancient, older than we once thought. Old enough to have killed pharaohs, old enough to have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. It needed us, needed our cities, our populations, our interconnected societies to exist. And once it found us, it never let go. For 3,000 years it shadowed humanity, a constant invisible threat lurking in every crowded marketplace, every cramped home, every ship that sailed to distant shores. The story of smallpox is ultimately the story of us, of human vulnerability, of human ingenuity, of human resilience. It is a story that begins in the midst of ancient history and ends in one of the greatest triumphs of modern medicine. But to get there, we have to follow the virus as it spreads, as it adapts, as it becomes one of the deadliest forces in human history. And that journey begins with the very thing that allowed human civilization to flourish in the first place, trade. Because as merchants carried silk and spices along ancient roads, they carried something else too, something invisible, something deadly. The silk. Roads were not just routes of commerce and culture, they were highways of disease. And in our next part, we're going to follow smallpox as it travels from east to west, from village to village, from empire to empire, leaving devastation in its wake. We will witness plagues that killed millions. We will see the Antonine Plague bring the mighty Roman Empire to its knees. We will watch as this tiny virus becomes a force more powerful than any army, any weapon, any king. The ancient curse is about to spread, and the world will never be the same. There is something darkly ironic about progress, is there not? The same innovations that allowed humanity to flourish, cities, trade, exploration, also created the perfect conditions for disease to thrive. As civilizations grew, and trade routes stretched across continents, connecting the ancient world in ways that would have seemed impossible just centuries before, smallpox hitched a ride. And what a ride it was. Imagine yourself as a merchant in the 4th century of the Common Era. You're standing in a bustling marketplace in Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. Around you, traders from every corner of the known world are hawking their wares. Silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, incense from Arabia, gold from Africa. The air is thick with a dozen different languages, the scent of exotic goods, the excitement of commerce connecting east and west. You make a deal with a trader from Persia, you shake hands, you exchange coins, you laugh together over wine, and in that moment, without either of you knowing it, you have just become exposed to a virus that will travel with you back home, infecting your family, your neighbors, your entire city. This is how smallpox conquered the world, not through armies or invasions, but through the very thing that made civilization great, human connection. The spread of smallpox follows the spread of humanity itself. It is a shadow history running parallel to all the grand narratives we learn in school, the rise of empires, the birth of religions, the great wars and conquests. But underneath all of that, invisible and relentless, Smallpox was writing its own story in human flesh. Let me take you back even further to a moment that historians still debate to this day. The year is 430 before the Common Era. Athens, the cradle of Western democracy, the home of Socrates and Plato, is under siege. Not by an enemy army. Well, okay, the Spartans are involved, but by something far more terrifying. A plague has descended upon the city. The historian Thucydides, who actually witnessed and survived this plague himself, left us a description that is absolutely chilling. He wrote, that people were seized by violent fevers. Their eyes became inflamed, their throats and tongues turned bloody, their skin broke out in pustules and ulcers. The stench of death filled the streets, bodies piled up in temples. Because there was no one left to bury them, the social order completely collapsed. People abandoned all decency, all morality, because they assumed they would be dead within days anyway. For centuries, historians assumed this was the bubonic plague, but in recent decades, some researchers have asked, what if it was smallpox? The symptoms match, the devastation matches, the timing matches. Thucydides mentions that the disease came from Ethiopia, traveled through Egypt and Libya, and then spread into Persia before reaching Athens. That is exactly the kind of trade route movement we see with smallpox. Now, we cannot be 100% certain. We do not have any preserved DNA from victims of the plague of Athens, but the possibility is absolutely there. And if it was smallpox, then this plague that killed perhaps a quarter of Athens' population, that weakened the city so much it eventually lost the Peloponnesian War, that changed the entire trajectory of Greek civilization. All of that can be laid at the feet of this tiny virus. But whether or not the plague of Athens was smallpox, we know for absolute certain what happened 3.5 centuries later. And this one is a game-changer. The year is a 165 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire is at its peak. The emperor is Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, one of the most admired rulers in Roman history. Roman legions have just returned victorious from a campaign in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. They are heroes, they're conquerors, and they are carrying something deadly. Within months, a plague begins to spread through the Roman Empire like wildfire. It starts with the soldiers, then their families, then entire cities. The disease spreads along the famous Roman roads, those magnificent engineering marvels that connected the empire from Britain to the Middle East. Every road, every trade route, every military highway becomes a vector for transmission. This plague is called the Antonine Plague, named after the Antonine dynasty of emperors. And here is what we know. It killed somewhere between 312 million and 7 million people over a period of about 15 years. That is potentially more than 5% of the entire Roman Empire's population gone. The economy collapsed, the military was decimated, food production dropped because there were not enough farmers left alive to work the fields. The social fabric of the greatest empire the world had ever seen began to unravel, and the plague did not discriminate. Marcus Aurelius himself, the emperor, the most powerful man in the world, contracted the disease in 180. He died from it. Even the gods, it seemed, could not protect Rome's rulers from smallpox. Now, for a long time, historians were not completely sure what caused the Antonine Plague. The ancient sources describe fever, pustules, and rashes, but ancient medical descriptions can be frustratingly vague. However, in recent years, more and more scholars have concluded that smallpox is the most likely culprit. The symptoms match, the mortality rate matches, the pattern of spread matches, and most tellingly, after the Antonine Plague ended, smallpox became a permanent fixture in the Mediterranean world. It never left. It became endemic, which suggests that this was the moment when smallpox established itself in Europe for good. Think about the historical implications of that for a moment. The decline of the Roman Empire, something we spend entire semesters studying in school, may have been fundamentally shaped by a virus. Not just by barbarian invasions or political corruption or economic mismanagement, but by an invisible pathogen that killed millions and weakened the empire to the point where it could never fully recover. How is that for a perspective shift? But smallpox was just getting started. Over the following centuries, it embedded itself into the fabric of human life across the old world. By the 6th century, smallpox had reached Japan, carried by traders from China and Korea. The Japanese had never encountered this disease before. They had no immunity. The results were catastrophic. Entire villages were wiped out. The emperor himself fell ill, though he survived. In the 7th century, Arab expansion during the early Islamic conquest spread smallpox into North Africa, across the Mediterranean, into Spain and Portugal. The Moorish invasions of Europe were accompanied by waves of smallpox outbreaks that devastated both Muslim and Christian populations. Then came the Crusades. Oh, the Crusades, if you want a perfect example of how war and disease work together as partners in devastation, look no further. Starting in the 11th century, Christian armies from all over Europe marched to the Holy Land to fight for control of Jerusalem. They traveled through different climate zones, different disease environments. They lived in crowded military camps, where sanitation was, shall we say, not a priority. They came into contact with populations that had different disease immunities. And then after years of fighting, the survivors came home. Guess what they brought back with them? Not just stories of glory and bags of plunder, but smallpox. The disease spread through Europe like a wave, hitting one region after another. Crusaders who thought they were doing God's work were actually serving as unwitting carriers for one of humanity's deadliest enemies. By the 15th century, smallpox was so common in Europe that it was simply accepted as part of life. Parents expected that their children would get it. Some would die. Most would survive with scars. That was just how things were in London. By the 1600s, smallpox was responsible for roughly 10% of all deaths, 10% every year just from one disease. But here is something that really strikes me when I think about this period of history. While all of this was happening in Europe, Africa, and Asia, there was an entire hemisphere, the Americas, where smallpox did not exist. The indigenous peoples of North and South America had been isolated from the Old World for thousands of years. They had their own diseases, sure, but they had never encountered smallpox or measles or typhus. They had no immunity whatsoever. Their immune systems had never seen these pathogens before. And when European explorers finally bridged that gap in the 15th and 16th centuries, the results would be so catastrophic, so absolutely devastating that it would literally reshape the demographic and political map of two entire continents. But that is a story of such immense tragedy that it deserves its own dedicated telling. We will get there. I promise you, we will get there. For now, I want you to understand the pattern. Smallpox spread wherever humans spread. It followed trade routes. It followed armies. It followed explorers. Every ship that sailed was potentially carrying the virus. Every merchant caravan that crossed the desert. Every pilgrim traveling to a holy site. The virus did not care about borders or religions or languages. It just needed hosts, human hosts. And we, in our desire to trade, to explore, to conquer, to connect, gave it exactly what it needed. There is one more aspect of this that I find absolutely fascinating, and it is something that does not get talked about enough. Smallpox did not just spread through obvious routes like trade and war. It also spread through something far more intimate, family. You see, smallpox is most contagious right before the pustules appear, and in the early days of the rash. That means that people who were infected often did not know they were sick yet. They felt a bit feverish maybe, but nothing alarming. So what did they do? They went about their normal lives. They hugged their children. They kissed their spouses. They shared meals with their parents. They attended weddings and funerals and religious ceremonies. And in doing so, they spread the virus to the people they loved most. By the time the telltale pustules appeared, and everyone realized, oh no, it is smallpox. The damage was already done. The virus had already jumped to multiple new hosts. This is why smallpox was so effective at becoming endemic in human populations. It did not need dramatic vectors like rats and fleas the way the bubonic plague did. It did not need mosquitoes the way malaria does. It just needed us, our touch, our breath, our care for one another, the very things that make us human. Our compassion, our family bonds, our communal nature became transmission routes for the virus. There is something profoundly sad about that, is there not? Now, before we move forward, I want to address something that might be on your mind. With all this death, all this devastation, all these centuries of smallpox raging through human populations, you might be wondering, did people just accept it? Did they just throw up their hands and say, well, I guess this is how things are? And the answer is mostly yes. For a very long time, they did, because what else could they do? They did not understand viruses. They did not understand contagion. Not really. They had theories, bad air, divine punishment, astrological influences, but none of those theories led to effective treatments or prevention. The best they could do was isolate the sick, which helped a little, and pray, which probably helped psychologically, but did nothing to stop the virus. However, and this is crucial, there were people who noticed patterns, observant physicians, folk healers, midwives, parents who had survived the disease themselves. They noticed that survivors never got sick again. They noticed that people who had mild cases seemed to develop the same immunity as people who had nearly died from severe cases. And, most intriguingly, some clever individuals started to wonder if exposure to smallpox creates immunity. What if we could control that exposure? What if we could intentionally give people a very mild case of the disease to protect them from a severe one later? That idea, that revolutionary, dangerous, brilliant idea was already being practiced in certain parts of the world, in China, in India, in parts of Africa, and eventually in the Ottoman Empire. But the Western world, with all its universities and its physicians and its scientific pretensions, remained completely ignorant of this practice for centuries. Why? Partly because of geography and isolation, but if we are being honest, also because of prejudice. The idea that backwards Eastern societies might have figured out something that sophisticated Europeans had not was simply unthinkable to most Western minds at the time. But here is the beautiful thing about truth. It does not care about prejudice. It does not care about ego or cultural superiority. Eventually, the evidence becomes too strong to ignore, and when it does, the whole world changes. We're about to witness one of those moments. We're about to see smallpox cross an ocean and encounter populations who have never seen it before. We're about to witness devastation on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. Civilizations will fall, empires will crumble, the map of the world will be redrawn, and all of it will be driven not by superior weapons or tactics or strategy, but by a virus so small it cannot be seen with the naked eye. The old world and the new world are about to collide, and smallpox will be there waiting, ready to write bloodiest chapter in its entire history. Get ready, because what comes next is going to break your heart. What I am about to tell you is one of the most tragic stories in human history. And I need you to understand something before we begin. This is not just about numbers or statistics or dates in a history book. This is about real people, real families, real civilizations that were thriving and complex and beautiful, and then were gone, almost completely gone, in a span of time so short it defies comprehension. So take a breath with me. Settle in, because we are about to witness what happens when a disease meets a population that has absolutely no immunity whatsoever. It is February of 1519. A Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés set sail from Cuba with about 600 men, 16 horses, and a few small cannons. His destination, the coast of what we now call Mexico. His goal to explore, to conquer, and let us be honest, to get rich. The Aztec Empire, which controls most of central Mexico at this time, is one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world. Their capital city, Tenochtitlan, has a population of around 200,000 people, making it larger than most European cities of the era. They have floating gardens called chinampers. They have massive pyramids and temples. They have a complex system of writing, mathematics, astronomy, and art. They have by any measure a thriving civilization. But here is what they do not have. immunity to European diseases. Cortés and his men land on the coast and begin their march inland. At first, the encounters with local populations are a mix of curiosity, diplomacy, and occasional violence. The Spanish have technological advantages, steel weapons, horses, gunpowder, but they are vastly outnumbered. By the time they reach Tenochtitlan in November of 1519, they are guests, not conquerors. The Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II receives them with a mixture of fascination and caution. For several months, there is an uneasy coexistence, but Smallpox is already coming, and it is not even traveling with Cortés's original expedition. It arrives with the next wave of Spanish ships carried by an enslaved African man who had contracted the disease before leaving Cuba. His name has been lost to history, but his impact, his unintentional tragic impact, cannot be overstated. He is patient zero for what will become the single deadliest epidemic in the history of the Americas. The virus begins to spread sometime in the spring of 1520, and here is where it gets absolutely devastating. Remember what I told you about Smallpox needing large, dense populations to thrive. Tenochtitlan is perfect. 200,000 people living in close quarters, active markets, communal ceremonies, extended family networks where multiple generations live under one roof. The virus spreads like lightning through dry grass. An Aztec account of the epidemic, preserved in a document called the Florentine Codex, describes the horror, in words that still make me shiver. Listen to this. The plague lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing a vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies. We were covered with agonizing sores from head to foot. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were so utterly helpless that they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs or even their heads. If they did move their bodies, they screamed with pain. Can you imagine writing that? Can you imagine being the person who survived to record those words, knowing that most of the people around you did not? A Franciscan monk traveling with the Spanish left his own account, and it is even more stark. He wrote, "As the Indians did not know the remedy of the disease, they died in heaps like bedbugs. Like bedbugs. The casual cruelty of that comparison, the dehumanization, it is almost too much to bear. But it also tells us something about the scale of death. Bodies were literally piling up faster than anyone could bury them. Here is what makes this epidemic so uniquely catastrophic. It was not just the direct deaths from the disease. Smallpox took its toll in multiple ways, like a perfect storm of devastation. First, yes, it killed a huge percentage of people outright. Scholars estimate somewhere between 60 and 90% mortality in communities with no prior exposure. The very young and the very old were especially vulnerable. But here is what people do not always realize. Smallpox also completely incapacitated survivors during the illness. For 1 to 2 weeks, infected people were so sick, in so much pain, that they literally could not get out of bed. They could not fetch water. They could not prepare food. They could not care for children or elderly family members. Now imagine what happens when half the people in a household are bedridden at the same time. Who takes care of them? The healthy family members, right? But in doing so, those healthy family members expose themselves to the virus. So a week later, they get sick, and by then the first group has either died or is recovering, but is still too weak to function. Do you see the cascade effect? Do you see how this becomes not just a medical crisis, but a complete social collapse? The Aztec farming system depended on labor-intensive agriculture. When farmers could not work their fields, when entire villages of farmers were dead or dying, crops did not get planted, crops did not get harvested, the food system broke down, famine followed epidemic, and famine weakened survivors' immune systems, making them even more vulnerable to secondary infections. But wait, it gets worse. The leadership of the Aztec Empire was decimated. Nobles, priests, administrators, anyone who lived in the dense urban centers of power died in massive numbers. Cuitlahuac, who became emperor after the Spanish killed Moctezuma, ruled for exactly 80 days before dying of smallpox. The entire command structure, the entire system of governance fell apart. And here is the truly tragic irony. The Spanish were mostly immune. They'd grown up in Europe where smallpox was endemic. Most of them had contracted it as children and survived. So while the Aztecs were dying by the thousands, the Spanish were walking through the devastation relatively unscathed. To the Aztecs, it must have seemed like divine intervention. How else could they explain why the invaders were immune to a plague that was killing everyone else? Some Aztec accounts describe a belief that the Spanish gods were more powerful than their own. Imagine the psychological devastation of that belief on top of everything else. By the time the epidemic burned itself out in late 1520, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of central Mexico was dead. Dead. The Aztec military, already weakened by conflict with the Spanish, was a fraction of its former strength. The morale of the population was shattered. The social structures that held civilization together were in tatters. When Cortés launched his final assault on Tenochtitlan in 1521, he was not conquering a mighty empire at the height of its power. He was delivering the final blow to a civilization that had already been brought to its knees by smallpox. Now you might be thinking, okay, that is one civilization, one epidemic. Surely that was the worst of it, right? Oh, if only that were true. Smallpox did not stop in Mexico. It kept moving south down through Central America. By 1524, it had reached Peru, and here is where the story becomes almost unbelievable in its tragedy. The Inca Empire, which stretched along the western coast of South America, had not yet encountered a single Spanish conquistador. They did not even know Europeans existed, but smallpox found them anyway, carried by indigenous traders and travelers moving along the extensive Inca road system. Ironically, one of the most impressive infrastructure achievements of the ancient Americas became a highway for disease transmission. The epidemic hit the Inca Empire like a bomb. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capic was in the northern part of the empire in what is now Ecuador when he contracted smallpox. He died. His designated heir died also from smallpox. So did most of the royal court and many of the empire's top generals and administrators. In one stroke, the virus decapitated the entire leadership of one of the largest empires in the world. What happened next was predictable, but no less tragic. With no clear line of succession, two of Huayna Capic's surviving sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, went to war with each other for control of the empire. They fought a bloody, devastating civil war that lasted several years and killed tens of thousands more people. The empire was divided, weakened, torn apart from within. And then, in 1532, a Spanish conquistador named Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast with fewer than 200 men. He found an empire in chaos, still reeling from the epidemic and the civil war, and he conquered it. Think about that. Fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers conquered an empire of millions. How is that possible? It is not really. Not without smallpox having done 90% of the work beforehand. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 60 and 90% of the Inca population died during the waves of smallpox that hit the empire in the 1520s and 1530s. 60 to 90%. Let me put that in perspective for you. Imagine if a disease swept through your country and killed 9 out of every 10 people, everyone you know, your family, your friends, your co-workers, your neighbors, gone, just gone. That is what happened to the Inca, and it was not just the Aztecs and the Incas. Smallpox, along with other European diseases like measles and typhus, swept through indigenous populations all across the Americas. In North America, the story was the same. When English colonists arrived in what is now Massachusetts in 1620, they found entire villages abandoned, the inhabitants recently dead from an epidemic that had passed through a few years earlier. Some colonists saw this as divine providence, as God, clearing the land for them. They did not understand, or perhaps did not want to, understand that they were the ones who had brought the diseases in the first place. By the time European colonization was complete, historians estimate that the indigenous population of the Americas had declined by roughly 90%. 90%. We're talking about somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. The exact numbers are debated because we do not have precise population data from before European contact. But even the most conservative estimates point to a demographic catastrophe unlike anything else in recorded human history. And here is something that does not get talked about enough. Most of these deaths were not from warfare, they were from disease. When we learn about the European colonization of the Americas, we focus on battles and conquistadors and colonists. We talk about military conquest. But the real conquest was biological. Smallpox killed far more indigenous Americans than all the Spanish swords and guns and cannons combined. It is not even close. In fact, some historians have argued that European colonization of the Americas would have been impossible without disease. The technological advantages Europeans had, horses, steel, gunpowder, were real, but they were not overwhelming. The Aztecs and Inca had vast armies, sophisticated tactics, and knowledge of the terrain. Under normal circumstances, a few hundred Europeans trying to conquer empires of millions would have been suicide missions, but circumstances were not normal. The indigenous populations were being devastated by diseases to which they had no immunity, diseases that the Europeans had brought with them, diseases that spread ahead of the Europeans themselves, softening up entire civilizations before the first conquistador even arrived. There is one more aspect of this story that I need to mention, and it is one that makes me deeply uncomfortable, but it is important, so I am going to tell you. In 1763, during the French and Indian War in North America, a British military commander named Sir Geoffrey Amherst deliberately discussed using smallpox as a biological weapon against Native American tribes that were hostile to the British. In letters that still exist, he suggested distributing blankets infected with smallpox to Native American communities. And there is evidence that this was actually attempted, though we are not certain how effective it was. But the intent was there. The intent to weaponize disease, to use smallpox as a tool of genocide. Let that sink in for a moment. Smallpox was so devastatingly effective at killing indigenous peoples that some Europeans thought, why not use it on purpose? The colonization of the Americas is a story of many things: exploration, cultural exchange, economic exploitation, military conquest. But underneath all of those narratives is the story of smallpox, a tiny virus, invisible to the naked eye, that killed more people than any weapon, any army, any intentional act of violence. It reshaped the demographic map of 2 continents. It destroyed civilizations that had existed for centuries. It enabled the creation of colonial empires that would dominate global politics for hundreds of years. All of that because of a virus. If you take away nothing else from this part of the story, take away this: disease does not care about technology or sophistication or culture or power. The Aztecs and the Inca were not primitive or backwards. They were advanced civilizations with achievements in architecture, astronomy, agriculture, and governance that rivaled or exceeded those of Europe in many ways. But they had never encountered smallpox. Their immune systems had no evolutionary experience with this pathogen, and that biological vulnerability more than any other single factor determined their fate. But here is the thing, and this is important. Smallpox did not just affect indigenous peoples in the Americas. Back in Europe, back in Asia, back in Africa, it was still killing people by the millions. It was still disfiguring survivors. It was still spreading through royal courts and peasant villages alike, because smallpox in the end did not discriminate. It killed emperors and beggars, nobles and servants, conquerors and conquered. And in our next part of this journey, we're going to see just how indiscriminate this disease truly was. We're going to enter the halls of power the palaces of Europe and watch as kings and queens fall to an invisible enemy that no crown, no wealth, no power could protect against. The virus that toppled empires in the Americas was about to remind Europe's royalty that they were not as special as they thought they were. You know what is fascinating about power? We build these elaborate systems to protect it. Castles with thick walls, armies with thousands of soldiers, guards at every door, elaborate protocols about who can touch the king, who can approach the queen, who can even look at a prince without permission. We create this illusion that the people at the top, the royalty, the nobility, the ruling class are somehow different from the rest of us, untouchable, divine even. And then a virus comes along and reminds everyone that biology does not care about your title. Let me paint you a picture. It is October of 1562, and Queen Elizabeth I of England is 29 years old. She's at the height of her beauty and power, unmarried, fiercely intelligent, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who crosses her. She has survived plots, assassination attempts, and the machinations of half the royal courts in Europe. She is, by any measure, one of the most formidable rulers of her age, and she's about to nearly die from smallpox. It starts innocently enough, a fever, a headache, nothing too alarming, but within days, Elizabeth is gravely ill. Her physicians are panicking. The pustules begin to appear, first on her face, then spreading across her body. For several days, it is unclear whether she will survive. Her advisors are already arguing about succession, about what will happen to England if their young queen dies without an heir. The entire future of the kingdom hangs in the balance. Elizabeth does survive, but she is changed. The disease leaves her face pockmarked with scars. For the rest of her life, another 40 years on the throne, she will cake her face with thick white makeup made from lead and vinegar, creating the famous pale visage we see in her portraits. It is not a fashion statement, it is camouflage. She is hiding the permanent damage that smallpox inflicted on her skin. But here is what is truly remarkable about Elizabeth's case. She is one of the lucky ones, because for every royal who survived smallpox, there were others who did not. Jump forward 32 years to 1694. Queen Mary II of England, co-ruler with her husband William III, contracts smallpox at the age of 32. Unlike Elizabeth, Mary does not survive. She dies after just a few days of illness, leaving the throne to William alone. Her death plunges the court into mourning and throws English politics into temporary chaos. Here is a woman who ruled over one of the most powerful nations on earth, who lived in palaces with hundreds of servants, who had access to the best physicians money could buy. None of it mattered. Smallpox killed her just as easily as it killed the poorest peasant in the kingdom. And this pattern, this absolute disregard for rank and privilege, plays out again and again across European history. It is almost as if smallpox specifically targeted the powerful just to prove a point, which of course it did not do. Viruses do not have motivations or intentions, but the effect was the same. Let me take you to France in 1774. King Louis X is on the throne. He is 64 years old and has ruled France for almost 60 years, making him one of the longest reigning monarchs in French history. He lives in the Palace of Versailles, that absolutely staggering monument to royal excess with its hall of mirrors and its thousands of rooms and its armies of servants. He has literally everything the 18th century can offer in terms of luxury, comfort, and medical care. On April the 27th, Louis develops a headache and a fever. By the next day, the telltale pustules begin to appear. His physicians try everything in their considerable arsenal: bloodletting, herbal remedies, prayers, everything. Nothing works. The pustules multiply. They cover his face, his body, even the inside of his mouth and throat. The smell becomes so overwhelming that servants have to perfume the room constantly. Courtiers who come to pay their respects cannot hide their horror at the sight of their once mighty king reduced to this state. Louis X dies on May the 10th, 1774. His death is so traumatic, so disturbing to witness that it contributes to a growing sense of unease about the monarchy in France. Here is a man who claimed to rule by divine right, who presented himself as God's chosen representative on earth, and he died the same horrible, undignified death as any commoner. The symbolism is not lost on people. In some ways, Louis's death from smallpox is a tiny crack in the facade of royal invincibility, a crack that will eventually widen into revolution. But here is where the story takes an absolutely bizarre turn. And this is something that blew my mind when I first learned about it. You would think that being wealthy and powerful would give you a better chance of surviving smallpox, right? Better nutrition, better housing, better medical care, all bar of that should help. And in some ways it did. Well-fed people generally have stronger immune systems than malnourished people. But when it came to the actual treatment of smallpox, being rich might have actually made things worse. Let me explain. In the 17th and early 18th centuries, European medical theory was dominated by something called brahmoralism. This was the idea that the body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness was caused by an imbalance of these humors. The treatment, therefore, was to rebalance them, usually by removing the humor that was in excess. For smallpox, which presented with fever and inflammation, doctors believed there was too much blood. So what did they do? They bled the patient. They would open a vein and drain significant amounts of blood, sometimes repeatedly over several days. Now think about what Smallpox actually does to the body. It causes a massive immune response. The body is fighting hard against the virus. It needs all of its resources, energy, blood cells, everything. And what are these well-meaning but completely misguided physicians doing? They're literally draining the body's resources. They're making it harder for the immune system to fight the infection. But wait, it gets even more absurd. There was a widespread belief that smallpox needed to be drawn out to the surface of the skin. So physicians would wrap her patients in red cloth. Yes, red cloth specifically because they believed that red light or red fabric would help draw out the redness of the pustules. Some doctors would place patients in rooms with red curtains, red bedding, red everything. There was no scientific basis for this whatsoever. It was pure superstition. But it was widely practiced even among the most educated physicians of the day. And then there were the dietary recommendations. Some physicians insisted that smallpox patients should be kept warm and should drink hot liquids to sweat out the disease. So they would pile blankets on feverish patients who were already burning up. They would give them hot beer or hot wine to drink. Imagine being sick with a raging fever and having someone force you to drink hot alcohol while wrapped in layers of blankets in a sealed room with red curtains. It sounds like torture, and in some ways it was. There is actually a documented case of a prominent English physician in the 1600s who noticed something peculiar. He observed that poor people who could not afford medical treatment and were essentially left alone to either recover or die seemed to have a higher survival rate than wealthy people who received intensive medical care. This should have been a clue that maybe, just maybe, the medical treatments were making things worse. But instead of changing their practices, most physicians dismissed this observation. They could not accept that their expensive elaborate treatments might be harmful. Their cognitive dissonance was too great. One particularly amusing or tragic, depending on your perspective, example comes from the treatment of a young noble who contracted smallpox in the late 1600s. His physician, determined to provide the very best care, instructed that the patient should be kept in a warm room with the windows sealed shut. He should be given only warm drinks, specifically large quantities of beer. He should keep the bed covers no higher than his waist, because that would somehow help the pustules develop properly. And under no circumstances should he be allowed to get cold or drink cold water, even though the patient was desperately thirsty and burning with fever. The patient survived, but probably in spite of this treatment, rather than because of it, and this was considered exemplary medical care at the time. This is what the best physicians in the most advanced nations in Europe thought was the right approach. Now contrast this with what poor people did. When a poor person got smallpox, they did not have access to physicians. They could not afford bloodletting or special diets or red curtains. So what happened? Usually family members would isolate the sick person in a separate room if possible, give them water when they ask for it, maybe some thin soup if they could eat, and otherwise just let the disease run its course. No interventions, no treatments, just rest and hydration and hope. And you know what? That was probably the better approach. Not because it cured smallpox, nothing could cure it, but because it did not actively harm the patient's already stressed body. There is a lesson in there somewhere about the dangers of overconfident ignorance, about how sometimes doing nothing is better than doing something harmful, about how wealth and education do not always translate to wisdom. But I will let you draw your own conclusions. Now, I want to tell you about something truly remarkable that came out of this royal relationship with smallpox, because smallpox survivors, people who had contracted the disease and recovered, had one incredibly valuable asset: immunity. They could never get smallpox again. And this made them extremely useful in societies where smallpox was a constant threat. If you were a smallpox survivor, in the 17th or 18th century, you could get work as a nurse or caretaker for smallpox patients. You could command higher wages because you could do this dangerous work without risk to yourself. In some places, smallpox survivors became a kind of medical currency. Wealthy families would specifically hire servants who had already had the disease, because they knew those servants could safely care for children if smallpox broke out in the household. There are records of job advertisements from the 1700s specifically requesting a nurse who has had the smallpox. These survivors were valuable. They were proof that immunity was real. Even if nobody understood how it worked, people knew from centuries of observation that you could only get smallpox once. If you survived it, you were protected for life. This was one of the foundational observations that would eventually lead to vaccination. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Again. Let me tell you about one more royal smallpox case, and this one is particularly significant because it happened in relatively recent history. In 1863, during the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln contracted smallpox. Yes, the Abraham Lincoln. He developed symptoms shortly after delivering the Gettysburg Address. You know, one of the most famous speeches in American history. Imagine that. Lincoln gives this profound, eloquent speech about the meaning of the Civil War, about democracy and sacrifice and national purpose. And within days, he is bedridden with smallpox. Lincoln had a relatively mild case, probably variola minor, the less deadly form of the virus, and he recovered after a few weeks. But during his illness, he was essentially incapacitated. The President of the United States, in the middle of the bloodiest war in American history, was too sick to work. Think about the national security implications of that. Think about how vulnerable that made the country, all because of a virus. And here is a detail that I find both poignant and darkly ironic. One of Lincoln's servants, a young man who cared for him during his illness, later contracted smallpox and died from it. So Lincoln survived, but someone who helped him did not. There is something almost unbearably sad about that. What all of these stories tell us is that smallpox was the great equalizer. It killed queens and paupers. It scarred princesses and peasants. It did not care about your bloodline or your wealth, or your education or your power. In the face of this virus, all of humanity was vulnerable. The only thing that mattered was whether you had been exposed before and survived. That was it. That was the only immunity that existed. And this lack of discrimination, this absolute biological equality, had profound social and political implications. Because when a disease can kill a king as easily as it kills a beggar, it raises uncomfortable questions about the supposed natural order of things. If royalty can die just as miserably as commoners, if their physicians and their palaces and their prayers cannot protect them, then maybe they are not as special as they claim to be. Maybe divine right Burr is just a story we tell ourselves. Maybe we're all just human beings, equally fragile, equally mortal. These were dangerous ideas in societies built on rigid hierarchies and inherited power. And while I am not saying that Smallpox caused revolutions, that would be too simplistic. I am saying that every time a beloved or powerful monarch died from this disease, it chipped away a little bit at the mystique of royalty. It made people think. It made people question. But there is another side to this story, a more hopeful side. Because the fact that royalty was dying from smallpox meant that royalty had a strong incentive to find solutions. When your own children are at risk, when your own family members are dying, you pay attention, you fund research, you take risks. And in the 18th century, some very brave and very privileged people were going to do exactly that. They were going to champion a practice that most of Europe considered barbaric and dangerous, a practice from the East that promised to protect against smallpox, but at a cost and a risk that would terrify most people. We're about to leave the courts of Europe and travel east to ancient China, to India, to the Ottoman Empire. We're about to discover that while European physicians were wrapping patients in red cloth and draining their blood, other cultures had figured out something much smarter. They had figured out how to fight fire with fire, how to use the disease itself as protection against the disease. And when this knowledge finally made its way to the West, it would change everything. But getting there would require challenging centuries of prejudice, overcoming fears, and taking risks they seemed insane at the time, but would ultimately save millions of lives. The cure, it turned out, had been out there all along. The West just had to be willing to learn from those they considered inferior. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people who consider themselves the most civilized are actually the last ones to figure things out. Travel back with me to 10th century China during the Song Dynasty. This is a golden age of Chinese civilization, a time of remarkable innovations in technology, art, literature, and yes, medicine. The Chinese have invented gunpowder, the compass, and movable type printing. Their cities are among the largest and most sophisticated in the world, and they are about to make a medical breakthrough that will not reach Europe for another 700 years. The story begins with tragedy, as so many great innovations do. Wang Dan, the prime minister under Emperor Zhenzong, is one of the most powerful men in China. He has wealth, influence, connections, everything a person could want, but none of it can protect his oldest son from smallpox. The boy dies and Wang Dan is devastated. He does what any grieving parent with unlimited resources would do. He calls together every medical expert, every scholar, every healer he can find. He essentially says, I do not care what it costs or how long it takes. Find a way to protect my remaining children from this disease. According to historical records, a Taoist hermit comes forward with a secret. Some sources claim this technique had been practiced quietly, almost like a mystical art since perhaps the 6th century. But it was not widely known. It was not written down. It was passed from master to student in whispered instructions, treated almost like alchemy. The hermit reveals the method. Take the dried scabs from someone recovering from a mild case of smallpox, grind them into a fine powder, and have a healthy person inhale this powder through their nose. Now imagine being the parent in this scenario. Someone is proposing that you deliberately expose your healthy child to smallpox. To you, smallpox is a death sentence, or at best a disfiguring nightmare, and this person is suggesting you voluntarily give it to your child. Would you do it? Could you? Wang Dan apparently did, and here is the remarkable thing. It worked. His remaining children were inoculated with this method, and they survived. They developed mild cases of smallpox, maybe some fever, maybe a small rash, but nothing like the full-blown life-threatening disease. And afterward, they were immune. They could never get smallpox again. But here is what I find absolutely fascinating. This technique did not immediately spread across China. It remained relatively obscure for another 500 years. Why? Partly because it was dangerous. This was not a vaccine in the modern sense. It was actual smallpox virus B, just hopefully a weakened version. Sometimes people who were inoculated developed full-blown smallpox and died. The risk was real, so families had to weigh the odds. Definitely risk death from natural Smallpox infection at some point in your life, or take a smaller but immediate risk through inoculation. It was not until the period from 1567 to 1572 BR during the Ming dynasty that variolation, that is the technical term for this practice, became truly widespread in China. By this time the technique had been refined. Practitioners had figured out through trial and error that using scabs from patients with the mildest cases gave the best results. They learned that the age of the scab mattered. Fresher scabs were more dangerous. Older scabs that had dried in the sun for weeks were safer. They developed elaborate procedures for selecting the right source material. In 1596, a physician and naturalist named Li Zhen published what is considered the first written description of variolation in a massive medical encyclopedia he had been compiling for decades. This book, which covered thousands of medicinal substances and treatments, included detailed instructions on the Smallpox inoculation procedure. It was no longer a secret. It was documented, systematized, available to anyone who could read. But the real gamature came in 1643 when a medical writer named Yu Chang published a book with the charming title Miscellaneous Ideas in Medicine, later reprinted as Tales of Herbs. In this text, Yu Chang provided incredibly specific practical instructions for variolation. He described the process of inserting cotton plugs soaked in dried smallpox scab powder into the nostrils of children. He talked about timing, the best seasons to perform the procedure, the best age for children to receive it. He discussed what symptoms to expect and which ones indicated danger. This was not mystical knowledge anymore. This was practical medicine. And here is where it gets even more interesting. By 1742, the Chinese imperial court itself officially endorsed variolation. They published a text called the Golden Mirror of Medicine, which listed 4 different methods of inoculation against smallpox that had been practiced in China since 1695. 4 different methods. The Chinese had been experimenting, iterating, improving their techniques for decades. The imperial endorsement meant that variolation went from being a folk remedy, practiced by wandering healers, to being official court-approved medicine. That is a huge shift. So why did variolation work? The people practicing it in China did not know about viruses or immune systems. Those concepts were centuries in the future. But they understood empirically, through careful observation, that exposing someone to a small amount of the disease material usually resulted in a mild infection that provided lifelong protection. What they had stumbled upon without realizing it was the principle of adaptive immunity. When you expose the immune system to a pathogen, even in a weakened or reduced form, the immune system learns to recognize it. It creates antibodies and memory cells specific to that pathogen. So if you encounter it again later, your immune system is ready. It can mount a rapid effective response before the pathogen has a chance to multiply and cause serious disease. The genius of variolation was that it took advantage of a crucial fact about smallpox. The route of infection matters. When you inhale dried scab powder through your nose, you're introducing a relatively small amount of virus into your body through a route that is somewhat less dangerous than, say, breathing in fresh respiratory droplets from someone actively sick with smallpox. The dried scabs also contain weakened virus. The process of drying in sunlight actually damages viral particles, making them less infectious. So you are getting exposure, but controlled exposure, just enough to trigger immunity, hopefully, not enough to cause serious disease. Of course, it did not always work perfectly. Sometimes people died from variolation. Estimates vary, but the mortality rate from variolation was somewhere around 2%. 2 out of every 100 people who were inoculated would die from the procedure. That sounds terrible, right? 2% mortality. But compare that to the natural mortality rate from smallpox, which was around 30%. If you were making a calculated bet on your child's life, variolation was the better gamble by a huge margin. It was not risk-free, but it was much safer than doing nothing and hoping your child never encountered Smallpox naturally. Now, China was not the only place that developed variolation independently. In India, a similar technique evolved, though with a different method. Instead of inhaling dried scabs, Indian practitioners would use a lancet, a small sharp blade, to make a tiny cut in the skin, usually on the arm. Then they would take material from a smallpox pule, either liquid from a fresh pustule or ground up dried scabs, and rub it into the cut. Same principle, different delivery method. The virus enters through the broken skin, triggers a localized infection that hopefully stays mild, and the person develops immunity. Indian medical texts from the 1st to 4th centuries of the Common Era mention smallpox and various treatments for it, though we are not entirely sure when variolation specifically began there. What we do know is that by the time European travelers started documenting Indian medical practices in the 16 and 1700s, variolation was well established. There were professional inoculators, usually Brahmin priests or members of certain castes, who would travel from village to village performing the procedure. It was a respected profession. People trusted these practitioners. They had generations of accumulated knowledge about which pustules to use, how deep to cut, what after air to provide. The technique also existed in parts of Africa, though it is less well documented in historical sources. What we do know is that some enslaved Africans brought knowledge of variolation with them to the Americas. There is a fascinating account from 1721 in Boston, where a minister named Cotton Mather learned about variolation from his enslaved servant, a man named Onesimus described how in his homeland in West Africa, people would deliberately infect themselves with smallpox to prevent the disease later. Mather was intrigued enough by this to advocate for variolation during a smallpox outbreak in Boston, though he faced massive resistance from the medical establishment. But let me take you to the place where variolation would eventually make its journey to the Western world, the Ottoman Empire. By the 17th century, variolation was widely practiced in Turkey. Ottoman sources tell us that the Seljuk Turks, who ruled Anatolia before the Ottomans, brought the technique with them from Persia and the Middle East, probably in the 11th or 12th centuries. By the time the Ottoman Empire was at its height, variolation was completely normalized. It was not some fringe practice or desperate last resort. It was just what you did to protect your children. Here is how it worked in the Ottoman Empire. There were professional women, usually older women, who specialized in performing variolation. Every autumn when the weather cooled and before the winter smallpox season began, these women would go from house to house, offering their services. A family would call for an inoculator. The woman would arrive with a nutshell. Yes, a literal nutshell containing matter from a recent smallpox case, carefully selected for being mild. She would ask the parents which veins they wanted opened. Sometimes she would make small cuts on the arms or legs. Sometimes she would scratch the skin. Then she would apply the smallpox material to these small wounds. The child would typically develop a fever and a small rash at the inoculation sites within a week or so. The family would care for them at home. Plenty of rest, light food, cool drinks. After a couple of weeks, the child would recover, usually with just a few small scars where the inoculations had been made, and from that point forward, they were immune to smallpox for life. No more fear of epidemics, no more watching helplessly as siblings or neighbors died. They were protected. Think about what a gift that must have felt like to parents. In a world where childhood mortality was incredibly high, where losing multiple children to disease was sadly common, here was something you could actually do to protect your family. It must have felt almost miraculous. But here is the tragedy. While all of this was happening in China, India, Africa, and the Ottoman Empire, while millions of people were being successfully protected from smallpox through variolation, Europe remained completely ignorant of the practice. Or worse, when European travelers did hear about it, they dismissed it as superstition or primitive nonsense. There was a deep-seated prejudice among many Europeans that they were the pinnacle of civilization and that backwards Eastern societies could not possibly have anything to teach them about medicine. This prejudice was so strong that even when European doctors stationed in the Ottoman Empire witnessed variolation with their own eyes and saw that it worked, their reports were largely ignored back home. In 1713, a Greek physician named Emmanuel Timon, who was working in Constantinople, wrote a detailed letter to the Royal Society of London describing the Ottoman practice of variolation. He explained the procedure, the success rates, the benefits. The Royal Society published his letter in their journal and then nothing. A few scholars were mildly interested, but there was no movement to adopt the practice. It was just too foreign, too strange, too at odds with European medical theory. The same thing happened in 1714 when another physician, Giacomo Pilarini, sent a similar report. He had even performed variolations himself on several people in Constantinople and documented the results. He had proof that it worked. But again, Europe was not ready to listen. Here is what I find both frustrating and darkly amusing about this. While European physicians were bleeding smallpox patients and wrapping them in red cloth, while they were prescribing hot beer in sealed rooms, while their patients were dying at rates of 20 to 30%. There were cultures that had already figured out how to reduce smallpox mortality to around 2%. The solution existed. It had existed for centuries, but European arrogance and cultural prejudice created a barrier that cost countless lives. It would take someone exceptional to break through that barrier, someone with enough social status to be heard, enough credibility to be taken seriously, but also enough courage to champion a practice that most of her peers would consider barbaric. It would take someone willing to risk her own children's lives based on what she had learned from people Europe considered inferior. Someone willing to face ridicule, condemnation, and accusations of recklessness in order to save lives. It would take, in other words, someone like Lady Mary Wortley Montague and her story, the story of how one aristocratic English woman learned about variolation in Turkey and brought it back to England, and the incredible resistance she faced and how she persisted anyway, is one of the most remarkable tales in the entire history of medicine. It is a story about courage, about challenging authority, about trusting empirical evidence over theoretical prejudice. It is a story about how one person can change the world even when the entire medical establishment is against them. And that is exactly where we are heading next. From the ancient wisdom of China and India and the Ottoman Empire, we're about to follow this life-saving knowledge as it finally makes its way to the West. We're about to meet the woman who would become variolation's champion in England, who would face down critics and skeptics and fearmongers, who would put her own children at risk to prove a point. And in doing so, she would set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to vaccination, to global immunization campaigns, and ultimately to the complete eradication of smallpox from the face of the earth. But getting there would require not just intelligence and persistence, but extraordinary bravery, the kind of bravery that looks foolish until it is proven right. The East had solved the problem. Now it was the West's turn to listen. History has a funny way of choosing its heroes. Sometimes the person who changes everything is not who you would expect. Not a physician or a scientist or a scholar. Not someone with formal medical training or institutional power. Sometimes it is an aristocratic woman with a sharp pen, a sharper mind, and the kind of courage that looks like recklessness until it succeeds. Meet Lady Mary Wortley Montague, born Mary Pierre Pont in 1689. She was the daughter of an earl raised in the highest circles of English society. She was brilliant, self-educated in Latin and literature because formal education was not available to women at the time. She was witty enough to become a fixture in London's literary and political circles. She was beautiful, or at least she was, until 1715 changed everything. That year, at the age of 26, Mary contracted smallpox. She survived, but the disease left its mark. Her face, once considered lovely, was now pitted with scars. Her eyelashes never grew back properly, but perhaps more devastating, her younger brother, her beloved younger brother, had contracted smallpox 2 years earlier and had not been so lucky. He died. And Mary never forgot it. She never forgot the fear, the helplessness, the arbitrary cruelty of a disease that could kill someone in the prime of their life. So when her husband Edward Wortley Monteague was appointed British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1716, Mary did not just follow him out of woolly duty. She went with curiosity, with her eyes open, ready to learn from a culture that most of her English contemporaries dismissed as exotic and inferior. And what she learned in Turkey would change the course of medical history. Imagine arriving in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, in 1717. You're an English aristocrat used to the rigid social hierarchies and the limited roles for women in British society. And suddenly you discover that in Turkey, there is this whole network of women who practice medicine, not as nurses under male physicians, not as midwives limited to childbirth, but as skilled practitioners of a medical technique that has been saving lives for generations. These are the Varilation women, the elderly experts who travel from house to house every autumn performing smallpox inoculations with the kind of casual competence that comes from decades of experience. Mary was fascinated. She made it her business to learn everything she could about this practice. She observed the procedure multiple times. She interviewed the women who performed it. She asked questions and, most importantly, she noticed the results. Turkish children who had been inoculated did not die from smallpox during epidemics. They did not bear the terrible scars that marked her own face. They were protected. In April of 1717, Mary wrote one of the most famous letters in medical history. It was addressed to her friend Sarah Chiswell, back in England. Listen to her words. "The smallpox so fatal and so general amongst us is here entirely harmless by the invention of engrafting, which is the term they give it. There is a set of old women who make it their business to perform the operation every autumn in the month of September when the great heat is abated. People send to one another to know if any of their family has a mind to have the smallpox. They make parties for this purpose, and when they are met, commonly 15 or 16 together, the old woman comes with a nutshell full of the matter of the best sort of smallpox and asks what veins you please to have opened. Can you hear the wonder in her description? Can you feel her excitement at discovering something that could save countless lives? But Mary did not just write about it. She did something far more radical, far more dangerous, far more courageous. In 1718, she had her 5-year-old son, Edward, inoculated in Constantinople, her own child. She entrusted him to the Ottoman women practitioners and to a procedure that most English people would have considered barbaric witchcraft. The physician who assisted because Mary wanted a European doctor present as a witness was her personal doctor, Charles Maitland, and I can only imagine what was going through his mind. He had been trained in conventional European medicine. Everything he had learned told him that deliberately giving someone smallpox was insane. But there was his employer, this determined aristocratic woman, insisting that he participate in this foreign procedure on her own child. What could he do? Young Edward was inoculated. An elderly Turkish woman made small incisions on his arms, applied matter from a mild smallpox case, and then everyone waited. For a few days, nothing happened. Then Edward developed a slight fever and a few pustules at the inoculation sites. Nothing severe, nothing life-threatening. Within 2 weeks, he was completely recovered, and now he was immune to smallpox for the rest of his life. The experiment had worked. But here is the thing about being right when everyone thinks you are wrong. Nobody wants to believe you. When Mary returned to England in 1721, she could have just quietly enjoyed her success and moved on with her life. Many people would have, but London was in the grip of a major smallpox epidemic. People were dying. Social life had ground to a halt because families were afraid to let their children out of the house. The fear was everywhere, and Mary had the solution. In April of 1721, during the height of the epidemic, Mary made a decision that would define her legacy. She had her 4-year-old daughter, Mary, inoculated, and she did it publicly. She invited prominent physicians to witness the procedure. She made sure people knew what she was doing. This was not a private family medical decision. This was a statement. This was Mary Wortley Montague saying, "I believe in this so strongly that I will risk my daughter's life in front of all of you, and you will see that it works." Can you imagine the pressure? Can you imagine the criticism she must have faced? She was a woman, and women in 1721 England were not supposed to have opinions about medicine, let alone challenge the entire medical establishment. She was advocating for a practice from an Islamic country, and England was deeply prejudiced against anything from the Ottoman Empire, and she was asking parents to do something that seemed completely insane: deliberately infect their healthy children with a deadly disease. The criticism was vicious. People called her reckless. They accused her of being a bad mother. They said she was too hasty, too influenced by backwards foreign ideas. One critic wrote that it was absurd for someone from a civilized country with an old parliamentary tradition to adopt medical practices from the Ottomans. The xenophobia and misogyny were not even subtle. They were right there in the open. But you know what else was right there in the open? The results. Little Mary recovered from her inoculation without any complications. She was now immune to smallpox, and the physicians who had witnessed the procedure, even though many of them were skeptical, could not deny what they had seen. News of the successful inoculation reached the royal court, and this is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because King George I became personally interested, not necessarily out of pure scientific curiosity, but probably because his grandchildren were at risk from the epidemic. The king wanted to know, did this really work? Was it safe? So he did what kings do. He ordered an experiment, but not on his own family. Oh no, he would test it on people whose lives mattered less. In the summer of 1721, 6 prisoners from Newgate Prison, 5 men and 1 woman, were offered a deal. They were condemned to death for various crimes, but if they volunteered to be inoculated with smallpox, and if they survived, they would receive full pardons. It was essentially an early clinical trial, though one with profoundly unethical aspects by modern standards. The prisoners were a human test, subjects whose consent was obtained through coercion. Agree to this dangerous medical experiment or be executed. Not much of a choice, really. But the prisoners agreed. Charles Maitland, the same physician who had assisted with young Edward's inoculation in Turkey, performed the procedures under the supervision of Hans Sloane, the president of the Royal College of Physicians. They inoculated 6 prisoners using the Turkish method, making small cuts and applying smallpox matter. They also tried the Chinese method on 1 prisoner, having her inhale dried scab powder through her nose. All 6 of the prisoners who received the standard inoculation survived. They developed mild cases of smallpox and recovered completely. They walked out of Newgate Prison as free individuals immune to smallpox. The woman who had received the nasal insufflation also survived, but she had a much more severe reaction. Terrible headaches, significant fever, more pustules. This suggested that the Turkish method was superior to the Chinese method, at least as practiced in this context. But, more importantly, the experiment had demonstrated to the British medical establishment that variolation worked. But even with royal interest and successful experiments, resistance remained strong. Many physicians were still opposed. Some of it was legitimate medical caution. Variolation did carry real risks. Some of it was professional pride. They did not want to admit that Ottoman women with no formal medical training knew something they did not, and some of it was just plain prejudice and fear of change. Mary did not give up. She continued to advocate for variolation. She wrote more letters which were circulated among the educated elite. She used her social connections to spread the word, and slowly, gradually, the practice began to gain acceptance. In 1722, two of the king's own grandchildren, the daughters of the Princess of Wales, were inoculated successfully. That was the seal of approval that really mattered. If it was good enough for the royal family, then it was acceptable for everyone else. Over the next few years, variolation spread through the upper classes of British society. Wealthy families began inoculating their children. The practice made its way to other European countries. Catherine the Great of Russia, always interested in progressive reforms, not only had herself inoculated in 1768, but then ordered that the practice be implemented across her empire. Over 2 million Russians were eventually inoculated. 2 million, that is an absolutely staggering number for the 18th century. But here is what I want you to understand about Mary Wortley Montagu's achievement. She was not a medical professional. She did not discover anything new. The Ottoman women had been practicing variolation for generations. What Mary did was something equally important and perhaps even harder. She built a bridge between cultures. She saw value in knowledge from a society that her own culture dismissed as inferior. She had the courage to trust that knowledge with her own children's lives, and she had the persistence to keep advocating for it even when faced with ridicule and resistance. Think about what the world would be like if more people approached other cultures with Mary's openness and curiosity. How much suffering could be prevented if we were willing to learn from each other instead of assuming that our way is the only right way. There is a beautiful irony in this story that I cannot help but appreciate. Europe, with all its universities and its medical schools and its learned physicians, had been struggling with smallpox for centuries. Their best treatments were useless or actively harmful, bleeding patients, wrapping them in red cloth, prescribing hot beer. Meanwhile, in China, in India, in Africa, in the Ottoman Empire, people had figured out a method that actually worked. It reduced smallpox mortality from 30% to about 2%, and it took an aristocratic English woman learning from Turkish women to finally bring that knowledge to the West. This is not just a story about variolation. It is a story about whose knowledge we value and whose knowledge we dismiss. It is a story about how gender and culture and prejudice can create barriers to the spread of life-saving information. And it is a story about how one person armed with nothing but conviction and courage can break through those barriers. Mary Wortley Montagu died in 1762, decades before vaccination would be discovered. She never got to see the full fruition of the seed she had planted. But because of her advocacy, thousands upon thousands of people were inoculated and protected from smallpox in the 18th century. She paved the way for the next great breakthrough, the one that would make variolation obsolete and eventually lead to the complete eradication of the disease. And that breakthrough was coming. Because while Mary was fighting for variolation to be accepted in high society, there was a young boy growing up in rural England who was learning medicine from his local physician. A boy who had become fascinated by an old folktale about milkmaids who never got smallpox. A boy who would one day perform an experiment that would change everything. Not just about smallpox, but about how we prevent disease altogether. His name was Edward Jenner, and his story is about to take everything Mary achieved and transform it into something even more remarkable, something safer, something that could be used on a massive scale, something that would become the foundation of modern immunology. The battle against smallpox was entering its final phase. The weapons were almost ready, and the war would soon turn in humanity's favor. Every once in a while, someone pays attention to something that everyone else ignores, a detail so ordinary, so commonplace that it has been sitting there in plain sight for generations, and nobody thought it was important. Until one person looks at it differently, and sees not just folklore, but the key to saving millions of lives. Edward Jenner was born in 1749 in Berkeley, a small town in Gloucestershire, England. This was rural England, farms, fields, livestock, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and gossip traveled faster than any disease. Jenner came from a respectable family, but he was not wealthy or particularly welcomed. At 13 years old, he was apprenticed to a local surgeon to learn medicine, and it was during this apprenticeship that he first heard the story that would change his life. The story was simple, almost a throwaway comment. A milkmaid, and we do not even know her name, mentioned to someone that she could not catch smallpox because she had already had cowpox. Cowpox was a mild disease that affected cows and could occasionally spread to the humans who milked them. It caused small pustules on the hands, maybe a slight fever, but nothing serious, nothing life-threatening. And according to local wisdom, if you had gotten cowpox from milking infected cows, you would never get smallpox. This was not new information. Dairy farmers had been saying this for decades, maybe centuries. It was common knowledge in the countryside. But common knowledge and scientific understanding are two very different things. Most people heard this folk belief and thought, interesting, and then moved on with their lives. But Jenner heard it and thought, wait, if that is true, then we do not need to use actual smallpox for variolation. We could use cowpox instead. We could give people immunity to smallpox without ever exposing them to smallpox. Do you see the brilliance of that leap? Variolation worked. Yes, but it was dangerous because it used real smallpox virus. About 2% of people who were variolated died from the procedure. But if cowpox could provide the same immunity without the risk of death, that would be revolutionary. That would change everything. But Jenner was just a country doctor at this point. He did not have the resources or the connections to pursue this idea immediately. So he waited, he observed, he collected evidence. For years, decades actually, he paid attention to the milkmaids and dairy workers in his area. He noticed that those who had contracted cowpox from their work indeed seemed to be immune when smallpox epidemic swept through. He talked to people, asked questions, built up a body of anecdotal evidence. He was patient, he was methodical, he was careful. And then in 1796, he made his move. On May 14, 1796, Jenner performed one of the most famous medical experiments in history. His test subject was an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. James was the son of Jenner's gardener, which tells you something about the class dynamics at play here. Jenner did not experiment on his own children or on children of the wealthy. He chose the son of his employee. By modern ethical standards, this is extremely problematic, but in the context of the late 18th century, this was how medical experiments happened. Informed consent, as we understand it today, did not really exist. The source of the cowpox material was a young milkmaid named Sarah Nelm. Sarah had lesions on her hand from milking a cow named Blossom. And yes, we actually know the cow's name. History has preserved that detail. Jenner took material from the cowpox pustules on Sarah's hand and used it to inoculate young James Phipps. He made 2 small cuts on James's arm and rubbed the cowpox matter into the wounds. Now imagine being James Phipps. You are 8 years old. A doctor, someone you probably trust because he is treating you like you are important, like you're part of something significant, is deliberately infecting you with something. You do not fully understand why. Your parents have agreed to this, probably because they work for this man and do not feel they can refuse, and you just have to trust that everything will be okay. James developed a mild reaction, a small fever, some discomfort at the inoculation sites, but nothing serious. Within a couple of weeks he was completely fine, and now came the real test, the part of the experiment that makes me uncomfortable every time I think about it. 2 months later, in July of 1796, Jenner deliberately exposed James Phipps to smallpox. He obtained fresh matter from a smallpox patient, actual dangerous, potentially deadly smallpox and inoculated James with it using the standard variolation technique. He was intentionally trying to give this 8-year-old boy smallpox. Can you imagine the tension during those days after the inoculation? Jenna waiting to see if his theory was correct. James' parents probably terrified, wondering if they had just signed their son's death warrant, the entire outcome of years of observation and hypothesis resting on whether one little boy would develop pustules or not. James did not get sick, no fever, no rash, no pustules, nothing. The cowpox vaccination, and this was the first time the word vaccination would be used, derived from the Latin word va, meaning cow, had worked. James Phipps was immune to smallpox without ever having been exposed to smallpox. The experiment was a success. Jenner was elated. He had proof. He had evidence that his theory was correct. So he did what any scientist would do. He wrote up his findings and submitted them to the Royal Society of London for publication. This was 1797, just a year after the experiment. Jenner sent them a paper describing his observation, his hypothesis, his experimental method, and his results. And the Royal Society rejected it. They told him the evidence was insufficient. One successful case was not enough. The idea was too revolutionary, too at odds with established medical understanding. They suggested he gather more evidence, conduct more experiments. Essentially, they said, "This is interesting, but we're not ready to publish this." Now, some people might have given up at this point. After all, if the most prestigious scientific body in England was not interested, why continue? But Jenner was convinced he was right, so he spent the next year conducting more experiments, gathering more cases. He vaccinated more people, mostly children, mostly from working-class families, and then exposed them to smallpox to test their immunity. And case after case, the vaccination worked. In 1798, having been rejected by the Royal Society, Jenner did something bold. He self-published. He paid out of his own pocket to print a small book with a very long title, An Inquiry into the Causes and Effects of the Varaxini, a disease discovered in some of the western counties of England, particularly Gloucester, and known by the name of cowpox. It was only 75 pages long, but those 75 pages would change the world. In this book, Jenner laid out everything. He described the folk belief about milkmaids and cowpox. He detailed his experiments with James Phipps and other subjects. He explained his theory about how cowpox could protect against smallpox. He even went further and speculated about the origin of cowpox, suggesting it might have come from horses and then been transmitted to cows. He was trying to understand not just that vaccination worked, but why it worked. The response to Jenner's book was mixed. Some physicians were immediately convinced. They saw the elegance of the solution, the strength of the evidence. They began vaccinating their own patients. But others were skeptical or actively hostile. The same prejudices that had opposed variolation now opposed vaccination. People said it was unnatural. They said it was dangerous. They said that deliberately infecting people with animal diseases would turn them into animals. I am not joking about that last part. There were political cartoons from this period showing people who'd been vaccinated sprouting cow parts, horns, udders, tails. The anti-vaccination movement is not a modern phenomenon. It has been around since the very beginning. People were afraid of the unknown. They were distrustful of new medical procedures, and they spread misinformation and fear, just like some people do today. But here is the crucial difference between vaccination and variolation. Vaccination was safer, much safer. With variolation, you were using actual smallpox, and about 2% of people died from the procedure. With vaccination, you were using cowpox, which was inherently much milder and almost never fatal. The risk was dramatically reduced. So even though both procedures involved deliberately infecting someone, vaccination was clearly the better option. And slowly, gradually, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Physicians who vaccinated their patients saw the results. Communities that embraced vaccination saw their smallpox mortality rates plummet. The word spread. By 1801, more than 100,000 people in England had been vaccinated. 100,000 in just 3 years. That is an absolutely remarkable adoption rate for a brand new medical procedure. The news crossed the Atlantic. In 1806, President Thomas Jefferson, yes, that Thomas Jefferson, founding father and third president of the United States, wrote a letter to Jenner. Listen to what he said. Future generations will know by history only that the Lothome smallpox existed and by you has been extirpated, completely eliminated. Jefferson understood even in 1806 that Jenner had given humanity the tools to potentially eradicate smallpox entirely. Governments began to take notice. Bavaria made vaccination mandatory in 1807. Denmark followed in 1810. Other European countries gradually adopted policies encouraging or requiring vaccination. The practice spread to the Americas, to Asia, to Africa. Everywhere vaccination went. Smallpox mortality decreased. It was undeniable it was working. But there were challenges. Remember, this was the early 1800s. There were no pharmaceutical companies mass-producing vaccines. The only way to maintain a supply of cowpox vaccine was to transfer it from person to person, arm to arm. A physician would vaccinate someone with fresh cowpox matter. A week later, when pules had formed at the vaccination site, the physician would take material from those pustules and use it to vaccinate the next person and then repeat the process. Human beings were essentially living vaccine factories. This system worked, but it had problems. Sometimes the cowpox virus would die out in a chain of arm-to-arm vaccinations, and physicians would have to go back to finding cows with active cowpox infections. Sometimes other diseases would accidentally be transferred along with the vaccine. There are documented cases of syphilis being transmitted through contaminated vaccination material. It was messy, it was imperfect, but it was still better than smallpox. In the late 1800s, the practice evolved. Instead of arm-to-arm transfer, vaccine producers began cultivating the virus on the flanks of calves. They would inoculate calves with vaccine virus, let the infection develop, then harvest the postal material and process it into vaccine. This was safer. It reduced the risk of transmitting human diseases. It also allowed for larger scale production. Suddenly, you could produce enough vaccine to vaccinate thousands or even millions of people. And here is a fascinating mystery that scientists still debate today. Sometime during this period, the virus used in vaccination changed. It started as cowpox virus. That is what Jenner used. But by the late 1800s, the virus being used in smallpox vaccines was no longer cowpox. It was something called vaccinia virus. Vaccinia is related to both cowpox and smallpox, but it is a distinct species. Nobody knows exactly when or how this change happened. Did the cowpox virus mutate during decades of cultivation? Was vaccinia accidentally introduced and then out-competed cowpox? Did some vaccine producer deliberately switch to a different virus that worked better? We do not know. The historical record is unclear. But regardless of how it happened, vaccinia virus became the standard for smallpox vaccination, and it remained the standard until smallpox was eradicated. By the late 1940s, scientists had figured out how to freeze dry vaccine, which meant it could be stored for long periods without refrigeration. This was huge. It meant vaccines could be shipped to tropical countries without losing potency. It meant you could stockpile vaccine for emergencies. It meant global vaccination campaigns became logistically feasible in a way they never had been before. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me bring us back to Edward Jenner. He spent the rest of his life promoting vaccination, corresponding with physicians around the world, refining the technique. He became famous, honored by governments, awarded medals and titles. Oxford University gave him an honorary degree. He was celebrated as one of the great medical pioneers of his age, and he deserved it. His insight, his careful experimentation, his persistence in the face of rejection, all of it contributed to one of the most important medical advances in human history. Jenner died in 1823 at the age of 73. He lived long enough to see vaccination spread around the world. He lived long enough to see smallpox deaths decrease dramatically in countries that embraced the practice. But he did not live long enough to see his ultimate dream realized, the complete eradication of smallpox from Earth. That would take another 150 years, incredible international cooperation, and some very clever innovations in public health strategy. But here is the beautiful truth. Jenner made it possible. He gave humanity the weapon we would eventually use to win the war against smallpox. He took a piece of folk wisdom, something milkmaids knew, something country farmers had observed, and he turned it into rigorous science. He tested it, he documented it, he shared it with the world, and in doing so, he created the foundation of modern immunology. Every vaccine you have ever received, every shot that has protected you from disease, traces its lineage back to that day in May of 1796, when Edward Jenner vaccinated an 8-year-old boy with cowpox and changed medicine forever. But having the weapon is not the same as winning the war. Vaccination was powerful, yes, but for it to truly defeat smallpox, it would need to be deployed on a scale that the world had never seen. It would need international coordination, political will, massive funding, and some brilliant strategic thinking about how to actually use this tool to eradicate a disease from every corner of the planet. That story, the story of how humanity organized itself to hunt down smallpox and destroy it, is still to come. And it is a story of triumph and tragedy, of incredible dedication and heartbreaking setbacks, of a global effort that would ultimately succeed beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The weapon was forged. Now it was time to learn how to use it, having a solution, and actually implementing it are two entirely different challenges. You can invent the most brilliant tool in the world, but if people will not use it, if governments will not support it, if logistics make it impossible to deliver, then it remains just an idea, not a reality. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, getting smallpox vaccine to every corner of the globe was one of the most ambitious undertakings humanity had ever attempted. Let me paint you a picture of what vaccine distribution looked like in the early 1800s. Remember, there is no refrigeration. There are no sealed glass vials with stabilized vaccine that can sit on a shelf for months. The vaccine is living virus cultured on the skin of calves or transferred from person to person. It is fragile. It dies in heat. It dies when it dries out completely. And yet somehow, physicians and public health officials need to get this delicate biological material from Europe to the Americas to Asia to Africa to remote islands in the Pacific Ocean. How do you do that? The answer is both ingenious and slightly horrifying. You use human beings as living vaccine carriers. This is how it worked. A physician planning a voyage would vaccinate several children, usually orphans, because again, the ethics of this era are quite different from ours. Just before departure, a week into the voyage, those children would develop cowpox pules. The physician would then take material from those pustules and vaccinate a second group of children. A week later, those children would develop pustules which would be used to vaccinate a third group and so on, creating a chain of infection that kept the vaccine alive for the entire journey, which could last months. There's a famous expedition from 1803, led by a Spanish physician named Francisco Javier de Balmis. He was tasked with bringing vaccination to Spain's colonies in the Americas and the Philippines. He sailed from Spain with 22 orphan boys, vaccinating them in sequence throughout the voyage to maintain a living supply of vaccine. Think about that for a moment. 22 children, most of them probably under 10 years old, spending months on a ship, being deliberately infected with cowpox one after another. The mission succeeded. Balmis and his team vaccinated thousands of people across the Spanish colonies. But the human cost, the ethical questions, they linger. This was how the world got vaccinated in the early days. It was messy, it was slow, it was expensive, and it required the kind of dedication and organization that was difficult to sustain over time. But where there was political will, remarkable things happened. Take Bavaria, for instance. In 1807, just 9 years after Jenner published his findings, Bavaria became the first country in the world to make vaccination mandatory. Not encouraged, not recommended, mandatory. Parents were legally required to have their children vaccinated. And you know what happened? Within a generation, smallpox deaths in Bavaria dropped to almost nothing. The policy worked. It saved thousands of lives. Denmark followed in 1810 with their own mandatory vaccination law. Sweden, Prussia, other German states, one by one, European countries began implementing policies to ensure their populations were vaccinated. And in these places, smallpox changed from a common killer to a rare disease. It did not disappear entirely. There were still outbreaks, still deaths. But the scale of devastation was nothing like what it had been in previous centuries. But not everyone was on board. In England, where Jenner had pioneered vaccination, there was significant resistance. Oh, the irony. The country that gave vaccination to the world was slower to adopt mandatory vaccination policies than many of its European neighbors. Why? A combination of factors. English culture placed a high value on individual liberty and was suspicious of government mandates. There was also a vocal anti-vaccination movement that spread fear and misinformation. Let me tell you about what happened in Boston in 1901 and 1902 because it is a story that will sound disturbingly familiar. In late 1901, Smallpox cases started appearing in Boston. The Board of Health responded by offering free vaccination at workplaces and at stations set up throughout the city. This was voluntary. By the end of 1901, about 40,000 people had been vaccinated. That is a lot, right? You would think that would be enough. But the epidemic kept growing. More cases, more deaths. The voluntary approach was not working fast enough. So in January of 1902, the authorities made a fateful decision. They initiated a door-to-door mandatory vaccination program. Health officials would go to people's homes and essentially say, "You must be vaccinated. If you refuse, you will face a $5 fine or 15 days in prison." Can you imagine government agents showing up at your door with vaccines and threats of jail time? The reaction was fierce. Some people genuinely feared the vaccine. They had heard stories of adverse reactions. They believed misinformation about vaccines causing other diseases or disabilities. Some people objected on religious grounds, believing that vaccination interfered with God's will, and some people simply resented the government forcing them to do anything. It was a violation of their personal freedom. They argued their body, their choice. This tension between public health needs and individual liberty is not a modern invention. It has been part of the vaccination story from the very beginning. And in 1902 Boston, it led to a landmark Supreme Court case, Jacobson versus Massachusetts. A man named Henning Jacobson refused to be vaccinated or pay the fine. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that the mandatory vaccination law violated his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court ruled against him. They said that in matters of public health, the government has the authority to mandate actions that protect the community even if individuals object. Individual liberty, the court ruled, has limits when public safety is at stake. This case set a legal precedent that still influences public health law today. But it did not end the debate. People have been arguing about mandatory vaccination for over a century now, and they will probably continue arguing for another century. Now, let me take you to India, because what was happening there in the late 1800s and early 1900s shows just how devastating smallpox could still be, even as vaccination was spreading globally. Between 1868 and 1907, less than 40 years, approximately 4.7 million people in India died from smallpox. 4.7 million, that is more than the entire population of Ireland at the time, gone just from one disease. And it was not just the total number of deaths, it was the persistent grinding nature of the disease. Between 1926 and 1930, India reported 979,738 cases of smallpox, with a mortality rate of 42.3%. That means nearly half of the people who got smallpox died, and this is in the 20th century, decades after vaccination had been proven effective. Why were so many people still dying? Several reasons. First, India was under British colonial rule, and the colonial administration's public health efforts were, to put it mildly, inadequate. Vaccination programs existed, but they were underfunded and poorly organized. Second, India's population was enormous and largely rural. Reaching every village, every community with vaccine was a logistical nightmare. Third, there was significant resistance to vaccination in some communities based on religious beliefs, distrust of colonial authorities, or traditional medical practices. And fourth, the vaccine itself was difficult to keep stable in India's hot climate. Remember, this is before freeze-dried vaccine. The vaccine would spoil during transportation, and people would be inoculated with dead virus that provided no protection. Contrast that with what was happening in the United States. The last outbreak of smallpox in the United States occurred in 1947 in New York City. A traveler arrived from Mexico carrying smallpox. Within weeks, there were 12 confirmed cases. The city responded with the largest and fastest vaccination campaign in history up to that point. Over 6 million people were vaccinated in less than a month. 6 million in one city in a few weeks. That is the kind of organized, large-scale response that becomes possible when you have infrastructure, funding, trained personnel, and public cooperation. The result, only 12 people contracted smallpox in that outbreak, and only 2 died. Compare that to India's 979,000 cases in just 4 years. Same disease, same vaccine, completely different outcomes based on resources and organization. But here is where things get really interesting. In the 1870s, something happened that showed the world just how important vaccination was. The Franco-Russian War. This war, fought between 1870 and 1871, triggered a massive smallpox pandemic. Had spread across Europe and killed approximately 500,000 people over 5 years, 500,000 people. And here is the kicker. The German-Prussian army had mandatory vaccination policies. French soldiers, many of them were not vaccinated. The French military leadership had not prioritized vaccination. They did not think it was necessary. So what happened when smallpox broke out during the war? The Russian soldiers were protected. They got sick occasionally, but mortality was eerie low. French soldiers, they died in huge numbers. French prisoners of war, crowded in camps with poor sanitation, died at horrifying rates. And then those French prisoners were eventually released and returned home, bringing smallpox with them. The disease spread from the French prisoner of war camps to German civilians, then to other parts of Europe. Paris suffered a particularly severe epidemic. The death toll was catastrophic. This pandemic finally convinced many European governments that mandatory vaccination was not just a good idea. It was essential for national security. Germany and England both passed stricter vaccination laws in the aftermath. France, somewhat belatedly, began to take vaccination more seriously, though they never implemented mandatory policies as strict as some other countries. But the lesson was clear. Vaccination works, and countries that fail to vaccinate their populations pay a terrible price. Now I want to talk about something that does not get discussed enough: the evolution of anti-vaccination sentiment. You might think that opposition to vaccines is a modern phenomenon driven by internet misinformation and celebrity activists. But the truth is, anti-vaccination movements have existed since Jenner's time. and understanding the historical patterns can help us understand what we see today. In the 1800s, anti-vaccination groups in England published pamphlets with illustrations showing children who had been vaccinated sprouting cow features, horns, tails, cow-like faces. The imagery was ridiculous, designed to provoke fear and disgust. They spread stories about children who had supposedly died from vaccination, often exaggerating or fabricating details. They held public meetings and protests. They lobbied Parliament to repeal mandatory vaccination laws. Sound familiar? The tactics have not changed much. The misinformation has the same flavor. What has changed is the speed and reach of communication. In the 1800s, you spread your message through pamphlets and public speeches. Today, you have social media and viral videos. But the fundamental psychology, the fear, the distrust of authority, the appeal to parental protective instincts, it is all the same. And here is what I find both frustrating and fascinating. Some of the concerns were legitimate. Early vaccination was not perfectly safe. There were cases of bacterial infections caused by contaminated vaccine material. There were rare but real adverse reactions. The arm-to-arm technique could spread other diseases. These were valid medical concerns. But instead of leading to better regulation, better quality control, better vaccine production standards, which did eventually happen, these concerns were weaponized by people who opposed vaccination entirely. They took real problems and used them to argue that vaccination itself was bad rather than arguing for improvements to make vaccination safer. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. A medical intervention has some risks, because all medical interventions have risks, and critics use those risks to argue against the intervention entirely, even when the benefits vastly outweigh the dangers. It happened with vaccination in the 1800s. It happens with vaccines today. It will probably happen with whatever medical advances we develop in the future. The question is, how do we as a society navigate these tensions? How do we address legitimate concerns while still protecting public health? I do not have all the answers to that, but I know that understanding the history helps. When you realize that people have been arguing about this exact issue for over 200 years, when you see the patterns repeating, it becomes clear that this is not a simple problem with a simple solution. It is about trust. It is about communication. It is about balancing individual rights with collective responsibility. And it is about making sure that public health institutions are worthy of trust, that they are transparent, that they listen to concerns, that they act in good faith. By the middle of the 20th century, Smallpox had been eliminated from most wealthy countries. The United States had its last case in 1949. Europe was essentially smallpox-free by 1953, but the disease was still raging in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. And as long as it existed anywhere, it was a threat everywhere. A traveler could bring it back. An outbreak could start. The only way to be truly safe was to eliminate smallpox from every single country on Earth. Total eradication. Nothing less would suffice. And in 1959, a Soviet scientist stood up at a World Health Assembly meeting and proposed exactly that. He said, "We have the tools, we have the vaccine, we have the knowledge. Let us commit to eradicating smallpox from the face of the earth." It was an audacious proposal. Some said impossible, but the World Health Organization voted to approve it. The goal was set. Now they just had to figure out how to actually do it. How do you eradicate a disease from a planet with 3 billion people, including remote villages with no roads, countries at war, regions with collapsed health systems, populations that distrust outsiders? The answer would require innovation, dedication, and a level of international cooperation that seemed almost miraculous, especially during the Cold War. But they were going to try, and against all odds, they were going to succeed. The final battle against smallpox was about to begin, and it would take us to some of the most remote and challenging places on Earth. Declaring war on a disease is one thing. Actually winning that war is something else entirely. And in 1959, when the World Health Organization first committed to eradicating smallpox from the planet, most people thought it was a noble but ultimately impossible dream. After all, Smallpox had been with humanity for thousands of years. It had killed hundreds of millions of people, it was endemic in dozens of countries, and the World Health Organization was asking the world to believe that within a few years, maybe a decade, this ancient scourge could be completely eliminated forever, gone from every village, every city, every country on Earth. The initial response, polite skepticism. Countries pledged support in principle, but when it came to actually funding the program, actually dedicating personnel, actually making it a priority, well, that was a different story. The first attempt at global eradication from 1959 to 1966 was, to put it bluntly, a failure, not a complete failure. Progress was made in some regions, but nowhere near what was needed. The program suffered from lack of funding, lack of coordination, lack of commitment from participating countries. Vaccine donations were insufficient. Training was inadequate. By 1966, Smallpox was still endemic in more than 30 countries, and the dream of eradication seemed as far away as ever. And then something changed. In 1966, at the World Health Assembly, there was a renewed push. Countries that had been lukewarm about eradication suddenly became serious. What changed? Partly, it was the realization that half measures were not working. If you were going to eradicate smallpox, you needed to actually commit to it. Real money, real resources, real political will. And partly, it was the involvement of some key players who would transform the campaign from a noble failure into one of the greatest public health achievements in history. The intensified eradication program officially launched in 1967. And this time things were different. The program had a dedicated leader, Dr. Donald Henderson, an American epidemiologist who would spend the next decade of his life obsessed with hunting down every last case of smallpox on the planet. Henderson was brilliant, driven, and by all accounts, not particularly easy to work with. He demanded excellence. He did not accept excuses, and he had a vision for how to actually make eradication work. But Henderson did not do this alone. He had a team of incredibly dedicated people working with him. Dr. Asawarita from Japan, who brought invaluable experience with smallpox eradication in his own country. Scientists and public health workers from dozens of nations and on the ground. Thousands upon thousands of local health workers, nurses and volunteers who would do the actual day-to-day work of finding cases, vaccinating contacts and tracking down every possible chain of transmission. At the start of the intensified program, in 1967, the numbers were staggering and depressing. Between 10 and 15 million people were getting smallpox every year. About 2 million of them were dying every year. 2 million. Think about that for a moment. That is more than the population of Philadelphia or Phoenix, just gone every single year. This scale of suffering was almost incomprehensible. So how do you tackle a problem that enormous? The original strategy had been mass vaccination. The idea was simple. If you vaccinate 80% of the population in an endemic country, you create enough herd immunity that the virus cannot spread. It will eventually die out because it runs out of susceptible hosts. This approach had worked in some countries, particularly smaller, wealthier nations with good infrastructure. But in large countries with remote rural populations, difficult terrain, and limited resources, mass vaccination was proving nearly impossible to implement. Henderson and his team realized they needed a different approach, and they found it by paying attention to the unique characteristics of smallpox as a disease. Unlike some illnesses that can spread while people are not showing symptoms, smallpox only spread when someone was visibly sick. The pustules had to be present. And smallpox also had a fairly long incubation period, about 12 to 14 days from exposure to symptoms. This created a window of opportunity. If you could find a case of smallpox quickly enough, you could identify everyone that person had been in contact with, vaccinate all of those contacts, and essentially build a ring of immunity around the outbreak. If you did this fast enough and thoroughly enough, the virus would have nowhere to go. It would be contained. This strategy was called surveillance and containment, combined with ring vaccination. Instead of trying to vaccinate every single person in a country, you focus on finding every single case of smallpox and then vaccinating everyone around that case. It is more targeted, more efficient, and crucially, it could work even in countries where mass vaccination was logistically impossible. But for surveillance and containment to work, you need to know where the cases are. You need people to report them. And in many parts of the world there was no system for that. So the eradication program created one. They trained local health workers to recognize smallpox. They offered rewards, actual money, to anyone who reported a case. In some regions, they put up posters showing pictures of smallpox pustules with text that said, essentially, have you seen this disease? Report it and receive a reward. They turned entire populations into a detection network, and they went house to house, literally. In some of the most remote and densely populated regions of the world, health workers would go door to door, village to village, asking, has anyone here been sick? Has anyone developed a rash? Can we examine everyone in this household? It was exhausting, time-consuming work, but it was necessary because you cannot contain what you cannot find. Now let me tell you about 3 technological innovations that made the intensified eradication program possible. Without these, I genuinely do not think eradication would have succeeded. First, the freeze-dried vaccine. In 1967, scientists finally perfected a method for freeze-drying Smallpox vaccine in a way that kept it stable for months, even in tropical heat. This was huge. Prior to this, vaccine had to be kept cold, which was nearly impossible in many parts of Africa and Asia. Freeze-dried vaccine could be transported anywhere, stored without refrigeration, and would still be potent when you needed it. This single innovation opened up the possibility of vaccinating people in the most remote corners of the planet. Second, the bifurcated needle. This sounds like a small thing, but it revolutionized vaccination. Before the bifurcated needle, vaccination required a certain level of skill. You had to make multiple punctures in the skin with a regular needle or a lancet, apply the vaccine, and hope you did it correctly. It was time-consuming and required trained personnel. The bifurcated needle changed everything. It is a simple device, a small needle with a forked tip. You dip the forked end in vaccine and a tiny amount of vaccine gets held between the 2 prongs by capillary action. Then you prick the skin 15 times in a small area. That is it. Simple, fast, reliable, and it used only a fraction of the amount of vaccine that previous methods required. You could vaccinate hundreds of people with a single vial of vaccine. Health workers with minimal training could learn to use the bifurcated needle effectively in just a few minutes. This meant that vaccination teams could move much faster and reach many more people. Third, the case surveillance system I mentioned earlier. This might not seem like a technology in the traditional sense, but it was a systematic innovation that made all the difference, creating networks of informants, training people to recognize smallpox, offering incentives for reporting cases. This turned the detection of smallpox from a passive process into an active hunt. The program was not waiting for people to show up at clinics. It was going out and finding them. With these tools in place, the intensified eradication program began to make real progress. And the strategy was to tackle the world region by region. You could not fight on all fronts simultaneously. You had to prioritize, focus resources, eliminate the disease from one area before moving to the next. South America was the first victory. By 1971, just 4 years into the intensified program, smallpox had been eradicated from every country in South America. The last case was in Brazil. 4 years, an entire continent freed from a disease that had plagued it for centuries. That success gave the program momentum. It proved that eradication was not just a fantasy, it could actually be done. Next came Asia, which was a much bigger challenge. Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. These were countries with enormous populations, many of them living in rural areas with limited access to healthcare. The logistics were nightmarish, but the teams persisted. They trained local health workers. They established surveillance networks. They vaccinated millions upon millions of people, and slowly, country by country, the number of endemic nations in Asia shrank. By 1975, smallpox had been eliminated from Asia. The last case in the region was in Bangladesh. That is less than 10 years from the start of the intensified program to complete eradication across an entire continent, which left Africa. And Africa, particularly the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia and Somalia, would prove to be the final battleground. These were countries dealing with war, famine, political instability, collapsing infrastructure, some of the most challenging conditions imaginable for a public health campaign. But the eradication teams kept going. They worked through conflict zones. They negotiated with warlords. They vaccinated refugees in camps. They tracked cases through regions where there were no roads, no phones, no modern communication systems. They relied on determination, creativity, and an absolute refusal to give up. Let me tell you about what this looked like on the ground. Imagine you are a health worker in rural Ethiopia in the mid-1970s. You have a backpack with freeze-dried vaccine, bifurcated needles, and maybe some basic medical supplies. You walk or ride a donkey if you're lucky from village to village. The terrain is rough. The weather is harsh. You might encounter armed groups. You might have to ford rivers. You might have to sleep on the ground. But you keep going because you have a job to do. Find every case of smallpox and stop it from spreading. When you arrive at a village, you gather the people together. You ask if anyone has been sick. You examine anyone with a rash. If you find a case of smallpox, you immediately vaccinate everyone in that household, everyone in neighboring households, everyone in the entire village if necessary. You create that ring of immunity. Then you ask, has anyone from this village traveled to another village recently? If yes, you follow that trail. You go to the next village and repeat the process. You're essentially a disease detective tracking down transmission chains and cutting them off before they can spread. This work was heroic. There is no other word for it. Thousands of people dedicating years of their lives to this mission, often in incredibly difficult and dangerous circumstances, and they were making progress. The number of cases was dropping. The areas where smallpox was still endemic were shrinking. By the mid-1970s, the finish line was in sight. Just a few more countries to go, just a few more regions to clear, and then it would be over. Humanity would have achieved something unprecedented. The deliberate extinction of a disease that had killed more people than any war, any famine, any other single cause in human history. But those final cases, finding them, containing them, ensuring there were no hidden chains of transmission still smoldering somewhere, would be the hardest part of all. Because when you are 99% of the way to eradicating a disease, that last 1% is the most difficult. The virus is cornered, hiding in remote areas. But it only takes one missed case, one undetected outbreak, and the whole thing could come roaring back. The pressure on the eradication teams was immense. They had come so far, they were so close, but they could not relax. They could not assume victory. They had to maintain the same intensity, the same vigilance, all the way to the end. And that end was coming. In the dusty, war-torn landscapes of Ethiopia and Somalia, the final act of this centuries-long drama was about to play out. The last patients were about to be identified. The last rings of vaccination were about to be administered. And the world was about to witness something that had seemed impossible just a few decades earlier, the complete and total defeat of smallpox. But we're not quite there yet. We still have to follow those final cases, track down those last chains of transmission, and witness the moment when human beings can finally say with certainty, it is over. We won. When you're hunting something to extinction, the last few are always the hardest to find. It is true in nature, and it turned out to be true for smallpox as well. By the mid-1970s, the World Health Organization's eradication campaign had pushed smallpox into smaller and smaller corners of the world. But those final corners, those last holdouts where the virus was clinging to survival, would test every bit of ingenuity, persistence, and courage that the eradication teams could muster. Let me take you to Bangladesh in 1975. This is a country that at the time has the highest population density on Earth. Over 70 million people crammed into an area about the size of Wisconsin. Dense cities, crowded villages, rivers that flood regularly, displacing millions, political instability, poverty, and smallpox, still endemic, still spreading, still killing. If there was ever a place where eradication seemed impossible, this was it. The Bangladesh campaign was led by some absolutely remarkable people, and they had to get creative. The standard approach of going village to village was not working fast enough. So, they did something brilliant. They mobilized school teachers. Think about it. School teachers know their communities. They are trusted. They have daily contact with children who are most vulnerable to smallpox. The program trained thousands of teachers to recognize smallpox and report cases. Suddenly, you had a surveillance network that reached into almost every village and neighborhood in the country. It was genius. They also did something that might seem strange. They offered rewards for reporting cases. Not just small token amounts, but real money enough to be meaningful to a poor farmer or day laborer. This created an incentive for people to come forward to overcome their fear or distrust of authorities, to actively participate in finding cases, and it worked. Reports started flooding in. Health workers would race to investigate each report, vaccinate, contacts, contain the outbreak. It was exhausting work, but the number of cases was dropping. And then, in October of 1975, came the moment everyone had been working toward, the last case in Bangladesh. Her name was Rahima Banu. She was a 2-year-old girl living on Bola Island in the southern part of the country. When health workers found her, she was covered in pustules, a severe case of variola major, the deadlier form of smallpox. The team immediately swung into action. They isolated Rahima and her family. They vaccinated everyone within a half-mile radius of her home. They set up guards, actual armed guards, to prevent anyone from entering or leaving the area until the outbreak was contained. They were taking no chances. This could be the last case of variola major in Asia, possibly in the world. They could not let it spread. Rahima survived. She recovered fully, though she would bear the scars of smallpox for the rest of her life, and she became, in a way, famous. Her case was documented, photographed, studied, because if no new cases appeared after her, then Bangladesh would be declared smallpox-free, and then all of Asia would be smallpox-free. The teams waited, days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. They searched frantically for any other cases. They followed up on every rumor, every possible sighting. They went house to house in surrounding areas, examining everyone for any sign of rash. Nothing, no new cases. Rahima Banu had been the last. In December of 1975, just 2 months after Rahia's case, Asia was officially declared free of variola major. After thousands of years of smallpox epidemics, after millions upon millions of deaths, the most populous continent on Earth was finally free of the deadliest form of the disease. It was an incredible achievement, but the celebration was muted because everyone knew the job was not finished. There was still variola minor, the milder but still dangerous form of smallpox, and it was still circulating in Africa. And more than that, there was the psychological challenge of maintaining vigilance even after such a major victory. You cannot relax when you are 99% of the way to eradication. That last 1% still matters. Now, let me take you to the Horn of Africa, to Ethiopia and Somalia, where the final chapter of this story would unfold. And I need to be honest with you, these were some of the most difficult conditions imaginable for a public health campaign. Ethiopia in the mid-1970s was dealing With famine, civil war, and a collapsing government, Somalia was not much better. Political instability, clan conflicts, drought. Infrastructure was minimal. In many areas there were no paved roads, no electricity, no running water. Communication was difficult. Transportation was difficult. Everything was difficult. And yet, the eradication. Teams kept working. They adapted to local conditions. In Ethiopia, they hired local guides who knew the terrain and could speak the languages. They negotiated passage through war zones, sometimes having to convince multiple armed factions to let them through. "We're not here for politics," they would say. "We're here to stop smallpox. This benefits everyone." And remarkably, most of the time they were allowed to pass. They traveled on foot, on donkeys, in the backs of trucks. They carried their supplies in backpacks and baskets. When they found a case of smallpox, they would set up camp nearby and stay until they were absolutely certain the outbreak was contained. They vaccinated hundreds of people at a time, creating those protective rings around each case. They tracked contacts, followed transmission chains, left nothing to chance. One of the most challenging aspects was dealing with nomadic populations. In both Ethiopia and Somalia, there were groups of people who moved seasonally with their livestock, following water and grazing land. How do you track smallpox when your target population does not stay in one place? The eradication teams had to think creatively. They stationed workers at wells and watering holes, knowing that nomads would eventually come there. They trained traditional leaders and respected elders in nomadic communities to recognize smallpox and report cases. They essentially turned the nomads themselves into part of the surveillance network. And slowly, painfully, case by case, the number of endemic areas in Ethiopia shrank. One district after another was cleared of smallpox and then carefully monitored for months to ensure no new cases emerged. By mid-1976, Ethiopia had been declared smallpox-free. That left only Somalia, one country, one final battlefield. Somalia in 1977 was not an easy place to work. The country was poor, politically unstable, and dealing with the aftermath of a war with Ethiopia over a disputed border region. Refugees were streaming across borders. Health systems were overwhelmed, and Smallpox was still there, still spreading, particularly in the southern regions of the country. The eradication team in Somalia knew they were dealing with the absolute last stronghold of smallpox on Earth. Every case they found might be the final case in history. The pressure was enormous. They intensified their efforts. More health workers were deployed. More resources were poured in. The surveillance network was expanded. The rewards for reporting cases were increased, and they made progress. The number of cases per month dropped from dozens to single digits. They were so close, so impossibly close. And then in October of 1977, in the coastal town of Merka, a hospital cook named Ali Mao Marlin fell ill. He was 23 years old, healthy, had never been vaccinated against smallpox. Ali had been driving two children who were sick with smallpox to a health center when he was exposed to the virus. He developed a fever, then a rash. When health workers examined him, they confirmed what they had both hoped for and dreaded. Smallpox, variola minor, the milder form but still smallpox. Ali Mao Marlin had just become the last person on Earth to naturally contract smallpox. He did not know it at the time, of course. He was just a young man, with a terrible disease being treated by doctors and health workers who descended on his case with incredible intensity. They isolated him. They vaccinated everyone in Merka, the entire town. They set up surveillance in surrounding areas. They left absolutely nothing to chance. Ali survived. He recovered after a few weeks of illness, left with some scarring, but otherwise healthy. And then the wait-in began. The eradication teams waited for the incubation period to pass. 14 days, then another 14 days, then a month, 2 months. They searched everywhere for any hint of another case. They investigated every fever, every rash, every rumor. They put up posters with Ali's picture on it, asking, "Have you seen anyone else with this disease?" They offered huge rewards for any information, but no new cases appeared. Weeks turned into months. Still nothing. It was beginning to look like Ali Marlin had truly been the last case, but the World Health Organization was cautious. You do not declare a disease eradicated lightly. They continued surveillance for 2 full years. 2 years of searching, investigating, verifying. 2 years of teams going door to door in Somalia and neighboring countries, examining millions of people, following up on thousands of false alarms. Because that is what it takes to be sure. That is the level of certainty required before you can tell the world that a disease that has killed hundreds of millions of people over thousands of years is finally, completely, utterly gone. And during those 2 years of surveillance, something else happened that reminded everyone just how dangerous smallpox still was even in its final days. In September of 1978, almost a year after Ali Marlin's case, a medical photographer named Janet Parker became sick at the University of Birmingham in England. Janet worked 1 floor above a laboratory that was conducting research on smallpox. She developed a rash. She was diagnosed with smallpox. But how? Smallpox was supposed to be gone from Europe. There had not been a natural case in England in decades. The investigation revealed what had happened. Somehow smallpox virus had escaped from the research laboratory, maybe through a ventilation duct, maybe through contaminated equipment. The exact route was never definitively determined, but the virus had reached Janet Parker and she had contracted smallpox. She died a week later. She was 39 years old. The head of the laboratory, overcome with guilt and grief, took his own life. Janet Parker became the last person to die of smallpox, not from a natural outbreak, but from a laboratory accident. It was a tragic reminder that even when a disease is nearly eradicated, even when it only exists in a few controlled laboratory settings, it remains dangerous. But Janet Parker's death, horrific as it was, did not change the fundamental truth. Naturally occurring smallpox was gone. After Ali Marlin's case in October of 1977, there had been no further natural transmission anywhere in the world. The 2-year surveillance period was completed. Thousands of investigators had searched across Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and neighboring countries. They had examined millions of people. They had followed up on every possible lead, and they had found nothing, no smallpox, anywhere. In December of 1979, a global commission of scientists from 19 different countries gathered in Geneva at the World Health Organization headquarters. They reviewed all the evidence. They examined the surveillance data. They questioned the program leaders. They looked at photographs and medical records. And, after careful deliberation, they made their announcement. Smallpox had been eradicated. The last naturally occurring case had been Ali Marlin in 1977. The disease was gone. Humanity had won. Think about that for a moment. For thousands of years, smallpox had been one of the defining features of human existence. Pharaohs died from it. Emperors died from it. Ordinary people died from it by the millions. It killed 30% of those it infected. It left survivors blind, scarred, sterile. It toppled empires. It decimated indigenous populations. It shaped history in ways large and small. And then, in the span of just a few decades, through human ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer determination, it was gone, eradicated. The only disease in human history to be deliberately driven to extinction. Not controlled, not managed, not reduced, eradicated, completely and totally eliminated from nature. The formal announcement would come a few months later, but in that room in Geneva in December of 1979, the assembled scientists knew they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that just a generation earlier would have been dismissed as impossible fantasy. And yet they had done it. Humanity had done it. Countries that were geopolitical enemies during the Cold War had cooperated. Developed and developing nations had worked side by side. Scientists, health workers, local volunteers, and ordinary people in villages across the world had all played their part. And together they had achieved the impossible. Ali Marlin, by the way, went on to become a polio vaccination worker in Somalia. He spent years helping with the campaign to eradicate polio, going door to door, vaccinating children, using the same strategies that had defeated smallpox. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of vaccination and disease eradication. He had been part of history as the last person to naturally contract smallpox, and he wanted to be part of history again by helping eliminate another disease. Tragically, Ali died in 2013 of malaria, but his legacy lives on. He's remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of humanity's victory over smallpox and as a hero in the fight against polio. The story was almost complete. The disease was eradicated. But there was still one final step, one formal declaration that would need to be made to the world. And that declaration, when it came, would mark one of the proudest moments in human history. A moment when we could look back over millennia of suffering and forward to a future when no child would ever again die from smallpox, where no parent would have to watch helplessly as pustules covered their baby's skin, where no one would bear the scars of a disease that had terrorized humanity since the time of the ancient Egyptians. That moment of triumph was just months away, and when it arrived, it would inspire hope that if we could defeat smallpox, maybe, just maybe, we could defeat other diseases too. Maybe this was just the beginning of what human cooperation could accomplish. There are days that change everything, days when the trajectory of human history shifts in a direction that seemed impossible just moments before. May 8th, 1980 was one of those days. On that morning in Geneva, Switzerland, representatives from every member nation of the World Health Organization gathered for a ceremony that would mark something unprecedented in the annals of medicine, perhaps in all of human history. They were there to formally declare that smallpox, the ancient scourge that had killed more people than any other infectious disease, that had toppled empires and reshaped civilizations, that had been with humanity for at least 3,000 years, was gone, completely eradicated. The first, and to this day, the only human infectious disease to be deliberately driven to extinction. The official statement was brief but powerful. The world and all its peoples have won freedom from smallpox. Read that again. The world and all its peoples, not one country, not one region, the entire world, every single person on earth from that day forward would never have to fear smallpox again. No child would die covered in pustules. No parent would watch helplessly as their babies succumbed to fever and rash. No young person would be left blind or scarred or sterile. The disease that had haunted humanity since the time of the pharaohs was gone forever. Can you even imagine what that moment must have felt like for the people in that room? Some of them had dedicated decades of their lives to this goal. They had traveled to the most remote corners of the planet. They had worked through wars and famines and political upheavals. They had faced skepticism, resistance, and countless setbacks, and they had persisted. And now they could stand in that room and say with absolute certainty, "We did it. We actually did it. Let me put this achievement in perspective for you, because I think we sometimes take it for granted. In the 20th century alone, just 100 years, smallpox killed approximately 300 million people. 300 million. That is more than the current population of the United States. That is more than all the combat deaths in all the wars of the 20th century combined. World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, all of them together. Smallpox killed more people. And this was not ancient history. This was within living memory. There were people at that 1980 ceremony who could remember when smallpox was still killing millions every year, and now it was gone. Think about what that means in practical terms. The eradication campaign cost about $300 million total. That sounds like a lot, right? But here is the thing. Since 1980, the world has saved over $1 billion every year, every single year, in cost that would have gone to treating smallpox, vaccinating against it, dealing with outbreaks, and managing the long-term disabilities it caused. Over $1 billion annually, which means the entire eradication campaign paid for itself in just 4 months. 4 months. And then everything after that has been pure savings. We're now over 40 years past. eradication, which means smallpox eradication has saved the world somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion. 40 billion. That is not even counting the value of the 300 million lives that would have been lost if smallpox had continued at its 20th century rates. But the real value is not measured in dollars. It is measured in human suffering prevented. It is measured in children who grew up without scars. It is measured in parents who did not have to bury their babies. It is measured in communities that could thrive without periodic epidemics devastating their populations. How do you put a price on that? You cannot. It is priceless. Now, I want to talk about why this succeeded when so many other disease eradication efforts have failed. Because smallpox is still the only human infectious disease we've eradicated. We have tried with other diseases. We're close with polio. We have campaigns against malaria and guinea worm and others. But only smallpox has crossed the finish line. Why? What made it possible? First, smallpox had some biological characteristics that made it vulnerable to eradication. It only infected humans. There was no animal reservoir where the virus could hide. If you eliminated it from humans, it was gone. Contrast that with something like influenza, which has reservoirs in birds and pigs, or Ebola, which comes from bats, or plague, which lives in rodents. Those diseases can be controlled in human populations, but they cannot be eradicated because they will always be out there in nature ready to jump back to humans. Smallpox did not have that problem. Eliminate it from humans and you eliminate it. Period. Second, smallpox had obvious symptoms. Those pustules were unmistakable. You did not need sophisticated laboratory tests to diagnose it. A trained health worker could look at someone and say, "That is smallpox," with a high degree of certainty. This made surveillance much easier. You could train village health workers, teachers, even ordinary people to recognize the disease and report it. Compare that to something like HIV, which can be asymptomatic for years, or tuberculosis, which often presents with vague symptoms that could be many things. Diseases that are hard to diagnose are hard to track, and diseases that are hard to track are nearly impossible to eradicate. Third, smallpox only spread when people were visibly sick. The virus needed those pustules to be present for transmission. There were no asymptomatic carriers walking around, spreading disease without knowing it. This meant that once you identified a case, you could contain it. You knew exactly who was infectious and when. Again, contrast this with something like COVID-19, where people can be contagious before they show symptoms. That makes containment exponentially harder. Fourth, and this is huge, there was an effective vaccine that provided long-lasting immunity with a single dose. The vaccinia vaccine worked. It was not perfect. There were rare side effects and immunity would eventually wane after decades, but for the purposes of creating rings of protection around outbreaks, it was ideal. One dose administered by a minimally trained person with a bifurcated needle gave you immunity within days. That is a public health dream. But beyond these biological and medical factors, there was something else that made smallpox eradication possible: unprecedented global cooperation. This happened during the Cold War. Remember, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an ideological struggle that defined global politics. But when it came to smallpox eradication, they worked together. Soviet scientists collaborated with American scientists. Western countries provided funding and vaccines to communist countries, and vice versa. Rich nations helped poor nations without strings attached. Political differences were set aside because everyone recognized that smallpox was a common enemy. A disease does not care about your political system or your ideology. It will kill capitalists and communists with equal enthusiasm. This cooperation was not easy. It required trust, compromise, and a willingness to put aside grievances for a greater good. But it happened, and it worked, and it showed the world something important. When we choose to cooperate, when we focus on our common humanity rather than our differences, we can accomplish things that seem impossible. The lessons learned from smallpox eradication have been applied to other public health programs. The surveillance and containment strategy, that idea of finding every case and vaccinating everyone around it, has been used for polio eradication and is still being used today. Ring vaccination was employed during the Ebola outbreaks in West Africa in 2014 and in the Democratic Republic of Congo in subsequent years. It saved countless lives. The idea of training local health workers and creating community-based surveillance networks has become standard practice in global health. The bifurcated needle developed for smallpox is still used for other vaccines in some parts of the world. The freeze-drying techniques that kept Smallpox vaccines stable in tropical climates paved the way for better vaccine storage and distribution systems for all vaccines. And perhaps most importantly, Smallpox eradication proved that diseases can be eradicated. Before 1980, that was just a theory, an aspiration. Now it is a demonstrated fact. We have done it once, which means we can do it again. We know what it takes. We know what strategies work. We have a road map. But I want to be honest with you about something. We have not replicated this success with any other disease yet. Polio is close. We're down to just a handful of cases per year, confined to a few countries, but we have been close for years now, and the final push has proven incredibly difficult. Other diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, HIV. We have made tremendous progress in controlling them, but eradication is not even on the table yet. It is too difficult, too complex. So why have we not eradicated another disease in the 40-plus years since smallpox? Partly because other diseases lack the convenient biological characteristics that smallpox had. Partly because global cooperation, which was remarkable during the Cold War for smallpox, has been harder to sustain for other efforts. Political will waxes and wanes. Funding is inconsistent. And frankly, once smallpox was gone, some of the urgency dissipated. Smallpox was killing 2 million people per year when the eradication campaign started. That created motivation. Other diseases may be devastating, but none of them have quite the same combination of high mortality, high visibility, and eradicability that smallpox had. But here is what gives me hope. We did it once. On May 8, 1980, humanity proved that when we commit to something, when we marshal our resources and our ingenuity and our cooperation, we can achieve the impossible. We can take a disease that has killed hundreds of millions of people over thousands of years and eliminate it from existence. We can save future generations from suffering that our ancestors endured. We can make the world better in a tangible, measurable, permanent way. Think about what it means that a child born after 1980 has never had to be vaccinated against smallpox. Think about how strange that would sound to someone from the 1800s or the 1900s, or any previous century. For all of human history until 1980, smallpox was just a fact of life. You lived in fear of it. You took precautions against it. You mourned the people it took from you. And now it is just history, just a story we tell. Kids today learn about smallpox the way they learn about dinosaurs, as something that existed long ago but is gone now, extinct. Not through natural selection or asteroid impacts, but through deliberate human action. That is extraordinary. That is worth celebrating. That is worth remembering. Because in a world that often feels like it is falling apart, where problems seem insurmountable and cooperation seems impossible, smallpox eradication stands as proof that we can do hard things. We can solve big problems. We can work together across borders and ideologies. We can take on a challenge that seems impossible and not only attempt it, but succeed beyond our wildest expectations. The declaration on May 8, 1980 was not just about smallpox. It was about human potential. It was about what we can accomplish when we choose to be our best selves, when we choose cooperation over conflict, when we choose to invest in the future, when we choose to believe that things can get better and then work to make that belief a reality. But even With this tremendous victory, even with this proof that eradication is possible, there is one final chapter to this story that we need to discuss, because smallpox is not entirely gone, not completely. There are still samples of the virus in existence, locked away in high-security laboratories, and the question of what to do with these samples, whether to destroy them or keep them for research, has been the subject of heated debate for decades. And that question matters because as long as Varroa virus exists anywhere, even in locked freezers under armed guard, there is a risk of accidental release, a risk of theft, a risk that this disease we worked so hard to eradicate could somehow return. And in a world where most people are no longer vaccinated, where immunity has faded, a smallpox outbreak today could be catastrophic in ways that are almost unthinkable. The final question of the smallpox story is not about the past, it is about the future. And it is a question we are still grappling with. Victory is never quite as complete as we would like it to be. Even after the world celebrated the eradication of smallpox, even after the champagne was poured and the congratulations exchanged, there remained an uncomfortable truth. The virus still exists, not in nature, not in human populations, but in two highly secure laboratories, one in the United States and one in Russia. And the question of what to do with these last remaining samples has been one of the most contentious debates in public health for the past 4 decades. Let me tell you where these samples are kept. In the United States, the virus is stored at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. In Russia, it is at the Vector Institute in Koltsovo, a small town in Siberia. Both facilities are maximum containment laboratories, the highest level of biosecurity that exists. We're talking multiple layers of physical security, armed guards, restricted access, air filtration systems, negative pressure, rooms designed to prevent any possible escape of the virus. These are not your average research labs. These are fortresses built to contain one of the deadliest pathogens humanity has ever known. The debate about whether to destroy these samples began almost immediately after eradication was declared. In 1996, the World Health Assembly, that is, the decision-making body of the World Health Organization, voted to destroy all remaining stocks of variola virus by June of 1999. The logic was simple and compelling. If smallpox no longer exists in nature, why keep samples in laboratories? Every day those samples exist is a day they could potentially escape through accident or theft. Destroy them and you eliminate that risk entirely. The virus would be truly extinct, existing only in DNA sequences stored as computer data. But then June 1999 came and went, and the virus was not destroyed. Why? Because the decision was postponed, and then postponed again and again, and here we are over 2 decades later, and those samples still exist. The debate continues. So what are the arguments on each side? Those who want to preserve the samples make several points. First, they argue that we need the virus for research into better vaccines and antiviral treatments. The current smallpox vaccine based on vaccinia virus works but has side effects. Some people cannot safely receive it. People with compromised immune systems, pregnant women, people with certain skin conditions. If we could develop a safer vaccine, one with fewer side effects, that would be valuable. And to do that research, some scientists argue you need access to the actual virus. Second, they point out that we do not fully understand how smallpox causes disease at a molecular level. There are still questions about how the virus evades the immune system, how it causes the characteristic pustules, why it is so lethal. Understanding these mechanisms could potentially provide insights applicable to other pox viruses or other diseases. Knowledge, they argue, is inherently valuable. Third, and this is the argument that tends to carry the most weight, there is a concern about unknown samples. How can we be certain that these 2 laboratories are the only places where variola virus exists? What if someone somewhere has kept a sample? What if there is a forgotten vial in some old laboratory freezer? What if a government has secretly maintained stocks for biological weapons research? If Smallpox ever reappeared, either through accident or deliberate release, we would need access to the virus to quickly develop and test countermeasures. Destroying the known samples would leave us vulnerable if unknown samples exist. On the other side of the debate are those who argue passionately for destruction. Their argument is rooted in risk assessment. Every day that variola virus exists in a laboratory is a day it could escape, and the consequences of that escape could be catastrophic. Remember Janet Parker, the medical photographer in Birmingham who died in 1978 after the virus escaped from a research laboratory? That was not some third-world facility with lack security. That was a modern, well-funded laboratory in England, and the virus still got out. If it happened once, it could happen again, and the risk is not just accidental release. There is also the possibility of theft. What if terrorists or a rogue nation obtain smallpox samples? Biological weapons are relatively cheap to produce compared to nuclear weapons, and Smallpox would be a devastatingly effective bioweapon. Most people under the age of 50 have never been vaccinated. They have no immunity whatsoever. A deliberate release of smallpox in a major city could kill tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people before it could be contained. It is a nightmare scenario that keeps public health officials awake at night. Those in favor of destruction argue that the research justifications are weak. We have completely sequenced the variola genome. We have that information stored digitally. If we ever needed to study the virus, we could theoretically recreate it from the genetic sequence. We do not need to keep live virus sitting in freezers. As for the argument about unknown samples, yes, it is possible someone somewhere has kept smallpox, but keeping our samples does not change that. If we destroy the official stocks, we send a powerful message that the world is serious about ensuring smallpox never returns. We demonstrate our commitment to keeping this disease extinct. So where do things stand now? The virus still exists in those two laboratories. The World Health Organization has established an advisory committee that reviews the research being conducted with variola virus. Every year they assess whether the work justifies the risk of keeping the virus, and every year they report to the World Health Assembly, and every year the debate continues. Destroy or preserve safety or knowledge, certainty or preparedness. There is no easy answer. Both sides have legitimate points. This is one of those genuinely difficult ethical questions where reasonable people can disagree. What would you do if the decision were yours? Would you keep the samples for research and preparedness, accepting the risk of accidental or deliberate release? Or would you destroy them, eliminating that risk but potentially leaving humanity vulnerable if the virus reappeared from an unknown source? I told you at the beginning of this story that we would explore every aspect of smallpox history, the triumphs and the tragedies, the victories and the ongoing challenges. And this is the ongoing challenge. This is the question that remains unresolved. Smallpox may be eradicated from nature, but it still casts a shadow over our future. But I want to end on a note of hope, because despite this unresolved question, despite the remaining risks, the story of smallpox is ultimately a story of hope. It is a story about what we can accomplish when we commit to something. When Edward Jenner tested cowpox vaccine on James Phipps in 1796, he could not have imagined that his experiment would eventually lead to the complete eradication of the disease. When Lady Mary Wortley Montague championed variolation in 1721, facing ridicule and resistance, she could not have known that she was setting in motion a chain of events that would save hundreds of millions of lives. When Donald Henderson and his team launched the intensified eradication program in 1967, many experts thought they would fail. The goal seemed too ambitious, too difficult, too expensive, but they did not fail. They succeeded against enormous odds across impossible distances through wars and famines and political upheavals. They succeeded, and that success stands as a testament to human ingenuity, perseverance, and cooperation. There is also a more recent reminder of the lessons we learned from smallpox. In 2022, the world faced an outbreak of monkeypox, now called epox, a disease caused by a virus related to smallpox. The response: ring vaccination, contact, tracing, surveillance, and containment. All the strategies developed during the Smallpox eradication campaign. And they worked. The outbreak was brought under control relatively quickly. Without the knowledge gained from fighting smallpox, the monkeypox outbreak could have been much worse. The lessons we learned are still saving lives, and looking forward, those lessons continue to guide us. The polio eradication campaign uses the same surveillance and containment strategies. Guinea worm is close to eradication using similar methods. When we talk about preparing for future pandemics, we talk about rapid detection, contact tracing, ring vaccination, all concepts refined and proven during the Smallpox campaign. The fight against smallpox taught us how to fight diseases. It gave us tools, strategies, and most importantly, it gave us confidence that eradication is possible. Think about what the world would look like if we had not eradicated smallpox. In the time since 1980, smallpox would have killed roughly 90 million people based on its 20th century mortality rates. 90 million. That is 90 million people who are alive today, who have lived full lives, who have had children and grandchildren. All because of the work done by thousands of health workers, scientists, volunteers, and ordinary people who participated in the eradication campaign. 90 million lives saved. How do you even comprehend a number that large? Every child born after 1980 owes a debt to the people who made eradication possible. You probably do not think about it. Why would you? Smallpox is just history to you, but that is the point. It is just history. It is not a clear and present danger. It is not something you have to fear, and that freedom from fear, that safety, is a gift from previous generations, a gift earned through decades of hard work, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to a goal that seemed impossible. So what is the ultimate lesson of the Smallpox story? I think it is this: the problems we face, no matter how large or how ancient, are not necessarily permanent. They can be solved. Diseases that have killed for millennia can be defeated. Challenges that seem insurmountable can be overcome, but it requires commitment. It requires cooperation. It requires the willingness to invest in solutions even when success is not guaranteed. It requires people who are willing to dedicate their lives to causes larger than themselves. It requires all of us to believe that a better future is possible and to work toward making that future real. Smallpox shaped human civilization for thousands of years. It killed pharaohs and peasants. It changed the course of empires. It was one of the fundamental forces that defined the human experience. And then in the span of just a few decades, through human effort and ingenuity, it was gone, eradicated. The only disease in history to be deliberately driven to extinction by human action. That is not just a story about smallpox. That is a story about us, about who we are, about what we're capable of when we choose to be our best selves, about the extraordinary things that become possible when we work together toward a common goal, about hope, persistence, and the power of human cooperation to change the world. And if we did it once, we can do it again. Whatever challenges we face in the future, whether they are diseases or climate change or poverty or war or any of the countless problems that plague humanity, we have proof that solutions are possible. We have proof that when we commit to something, when we work together, when we refuse to give up, we can accomplish things that seem impossible. The story of smallpox is a reminder that progress is possible, that things can get better, that the future does not have to be a repetition of the past. And that is a message I think we all need to hear, especially in times when the world feels overwhelming and problems feel unsolvable. From the ancient curse that killed Ramses V to Lady Mary's courageous advocacy to Jenna's brilliant insight to the global campaign that finally defeated the disease. The complete history of smallpox is ultimately a story of hope. Hope that we can overcome our challenges, hope that we can work together across borders and differences, hope that the future can be better than the past, and hope that, sometimes against all odds, humanity wins. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. We've traveled together through 3,000 years of history, from ancient Egypt to modern laboratories, from devastating epidemics to triumphant eradication. We have met pharaohs and milkmaids, aristocrats and health workers, victims and survivors. We have witnessed humanity at its most vulnerable and at its most triumphant, and we have seen proof that when we choose to fight for a better world, we can win. I hope this story has given you something valuable, maybe some perspective on our current challenges, maybe some inspiration to tackle difficult problems, or maybe just a deeper appreciation for the extraordinary achievements that have made our modern world possible. Whatever you take from this story, I hope you carry it with you. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please consider subscribing to the channel. There are so many more stories to tell, stories of human triumph and tragedy, of scientific breakthroughs and historical turning points, of the moments that shaped our world and the people who changed everything. I would love to have you along for those journeys as well. Until next time, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, we are capable of extraordinary things when we choose to be. The story of smallpox proves it. Good night.